Hello everyone, I am Manu Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote Manu Valley on the big island of Hawaii, a place so isolated that most tourists never even know it exists. I should have listened to the old Hawaiian man at the general store in Waipio Valley. His weathered hands had trembled as he'd pointed toward the trail leading into Waimanu, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That place. It's kapu, sacred. The night marchers still walk those paths. But I was a software engineer from Portland, raised on logic and skepticism. I dismissed his warnings as local folklore meant to keep hikers away from a pristine wilderness area. My girlfriend, Sarah Rodriguez, and I had planned this backpacking trip for months. We'd conquered the Appalachian Trail, survived 3 days in Death Valley, and thought we were prepared for anything Hawaii could throw at us. We were both experienced hikers, both stubborn, both too proud to turn back when things started going wrong. The hike into Waimanu Valley is brutal. 8 miles of switchbacks down cliffs so steep they make your knees buckle just looking at them. But the isolation was exactly what we craved. No cell service, no other hikers, just us and the raw beauty of Hawaii's untouched wilderness. The black sand beach stretched for miles, backed by 1,000-foot waterfalls that seemed to pour straight from heaven. We set up camp on the 3rd day near a grove of kukui trees, their pale green leaves rustling in the trade winds. Sarah had found the spot. She always had an eye for the perfect campsite. The area felt sheltered, protected by the natural curve of the valley walls. Ancient Hawaiian stone platforms dotted the landscape, remnants of a village that had thrived here centuries ago. "This place feels alive," Sarah said as we pitched our tent, her dark hair whipping around her face in the constant breeze. She had this way of sensing things I couldn't, always had, ever since we'd started dating 2 years ago. Like we're being watched. I should have paid attention to the goosebumps that rose on my arms when she said that. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to sounds I couldn't identify. A rhythmic thudding, like distant drums, that seemed to come from the valley walls themselves. When I mentioned it to Sarah over our instant coffee and granola breakfast, she just nodded grimly. I heard it too, and voices, chanting. "Probably just the wind through the rock formations," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. The trade winds had died completely during the night. The air had been still as death. On the 2nd day, things started going wrong in small ways. Sarah's GPS watch, which had worked perfectly for the entire hike-in, began showing impossible readings, placing us simultaneously in 3 different locations, none of them where we actually were. My phone, despite being in airplane mode to conserve battery, had drained completely overnight. "Look at this," Sarah called from near our food cache. She'd hung our bear canister from a branch the night before, a standard precaution we'd practiced dozens of times. Now it dangled 8 feet higher than where we'd left it, and the rope showed signs of fraying. Not cut, but worn, as if something had been pulling at it for hours. "Must have slipped," I said, but my hand shook as I lowered the canister. Inside, our carefully packed food looked wrong. The dried fruit had developed a sickly sweet smell that made my stomach turn, and our energy bars had crumbled to powder despite being sealed in their original packaging. Sarah's face had gone pale. "Mike, this food was fine yesterday. I checked everything before we hung it." By the 3rd night, we should have hiked out. Every rational part of my brain screamed that we needed to leave, but something kept us there. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the way the valley seemed to close in around us whenever we looked toward the trail leading out. The 1,000-foot cliffs that had seemed majestic on our arrival now felt like prison walls. That's when we saw Marcus. Marcus Thompson had been Sarah's college roommate's boyfriend, a guy we'd met at a few parties but barely knew. The last we'd heard, he'd moved to Seattle for a tech job. So when he emerged from the tree line near our campsite just as the sun was setting, my first reaction wasn't fear, but confusion. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing here?" He smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide, lasting too long. His hiking clothes were pristine, not a speck of mud or sweat despite the brutal trail into the valley. His eyes reflected the firelight like an animal's. "Thought I'd join you guys," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Hope you don't mind." Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Mike," she whispered. "Marcus died 3 months ago. Car accident in Seattle. Don't you remember? Jennifer told us at that barbecue." The thing wearing Marcus's face tilted its head at an unnatural angle, listening to her whisper. When it smiled again, I saw that its teeth had multiplied. Rows of them, sharp as a shark's, filling its mouth from gum to gum. "I'm much better now," it said. I don't remember grabbing the camping hatchet from our gear, but suddenly it was in my hands, and I was swinging it at the thing that looked like Marcus. The blade passed through empty air. It had moved impossibly fast, farther than any human could have jumped, and now it stood 20 feet away, still smiling that horrible smile. "The night marchers are coming," it said in Marcus's voice. "They're very excited to meet you." Then it vanished. Sarah and I huddled in our tent, the fabric walls feeling as substantial as tissue paper. Neither of us spoke about what we'd seen. Putting it into words would have made it real in a way our minds weren't ready to accept. But we both knew we had to leave at first light. Except first light never came. I checked my watch obsessively as the hours crawled by. Midnight, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., but the darkness outside our tent never lightened. If anything, it seemed to deepen, becoming so absolute that our flashlight beams barely penetrated 3 feet beyond the tent walls. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered. "The sun has to rise." But it didn't. By what should have been noon, we heard them. The drums had returned, but now they were accompanied by voices, dozens of them, chanting in what sounded like ancient Hawaiian. The sound echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to tell which direction it was coming from. Sarah was the first to see the lights. "Mike!" Her voice was barely audible. "Look!" Through the tent's mesh window, I saw them. Torches moving in perfect formation along the valley floor. Hundreds of them, arranged in precise military columns. As they drew closer, I could make out the figures carrying them. They were warriors, but not alive. Their bodies were translucent, glowing with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. They wore traditional Hawaiian garb, feather capes, helmets of woven fibers, carrying spears and war clubs. Their faces were painted for battle and their eyes burned like coals. The Night Marchers. Ancient Hawaiian warriors, cursed to walk the same paths for eternity, appearing to those who violated kapu, sacred laws. The old man's warning echoed in my head. We had camped on sacred ground. We had disturbed the peace of the ancestors. The column of ghostly warriors passed so close to our tent that I could smell them. The acrid scent of torch smoke mixed with something older, earthier. The smell of the grave. Their chanting rose to a crescendo, and I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my skull. Then, silence. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness. Her palm was slick with sweat, but her grip was steady. "Are they gone?" I lifted the tent flap with trembling fingers and peered out. The valley was empty, the torches vanished. But something was wrong with our campsite. Our fire had gone out, though we'd banked it carefully with enough coals to last until morning. Our backpacks, which we'd positioned carefully outside the tent, were gone. "Sarah," my voice cracked. "The packs." We crawled out of the tent, our flashlights revealing the impossible. Not only were our backpacks missing, but the ground where they'd been sitting showed no sign of disturbance. No drag marks, no footprints. It was as if they'd simply ceased to exist. Sarah's breathing came in short, sharp gasps. "This isn't happening," This can't be happening. But it was, and it was about to get worse. The thing that looked like Marcus emerged from the kukui grove, but now it wasn't alone. Behind it came others, hikers we'd never met, all wearing that same too-wide smile, all moving with that same unnatural grace. Men and women in various states of decay, their hiking clothes rotted and stained, their skin hanging in strips from their bones. "Time to join us," Marcus said, and his voice was echoed by a dozen others. "The night marchers are waiting." I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran. The valley that had seemed so beautiful during the day became a maze of shadows and false paths in the darkness. We stumbled over unseen rocks, crashed through ferns that sliced at our exposed skin, all while the sound of pursuit grew closer behind us. The fake hikers moved through the vegetation without making a sound, their feet never seeming to touch the ground. "The trail," Sarah gasped. "We have to find the trail out." But when we reached what should have been the valley's entrance, we found only solid rock. The narrow passage we'd squeezed through on our way in was gone, sealed as if it had never existed. The cliff face rose unbroken for 1,000 feet above us. We were trapped. Sarah spun in a circle, her flashlight beam dancing wildly. There has to be another way out. There has to be. That's when I noticed the symbols. Carved into the rock face were petroglyphs, ancient Hawaiian drawings that seemed to move in our flashlight beams. Stick figures with spears, spirals that made my eyes water to look at directly, and something else, a face that looked disturbingly familiar. It looked like Marcus. "Sarah," I whispered, "look at this." She turned her light toward the petroglyphs and we both saw it at the same time. The carved face of Marcus, but below it were dozens of others. Hikers, tourists, people who'd probably made the same mistake we had, people who'd camped on sacred ground and awakened things that should have stayed sleeping. "We're going to die here," Sarah said, and her voice was completely calm. "They're going to kill us and add our faces to the wall." The fake hikers had found us. They emerged from the forest in a semicircle, trapping us against the rock face. Marcus stepped forward, his deteriorating face split by that impossible grin. "The night marchers have marked you," he said. "You violated Kapu. You camped where the ancestors sleep. Now you'll join us." "What do you want?" I asked, surprised that my voice worked at all. "Want?" Marcus tilted his head. "We want nothing. We are nothing. We exist only to serve, to collect." One of the other fake hikers, a woman whose face was mostly missing, spoke up. "The living don't belong here. This place is for the dead." Sarah's flashlight flickered and went out. Mine followed a second later, plunging us into absolute darkness. But the fake hikers still glowed with that sickly inner light, making them visible as shambling silhouettes against the black. I felt Sarah's hand slip from mine. "Sarah," I called out, but there was no answer. A flashlight beam clicked on 20 feet away, illuminating Sarah's face. But it wasn't Sarah holding the light. It was Sarah, but wrong. Her movements too fluid, her smile too wide. When she opened her mouth to speak, the voice that came out wasn't hers. "Michael," she said in a voice like grinding stone. "Come with us. It's easier if you don't fight." I backed against the rock wall, my hand scraping against the rough stone. "You're not Sarah. What did you do with her?" "I am Sarah," the thing wearing her face said. "I'm just better now." Behind her, the fake hikers began to advance. I could smell the rot coming off them, hear the wet sound of their footsteps on the valley floor. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. That's when I felt it, a gap in the rock behind me. My frantically searching hands had found a crack in the cliff face, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It hadn't been there before, I was sure of it, but I didn't have time to question the impossible. I slipped through the crack just as the fake hikers reached for me, their cold fingers brushing against my shirt. The passage was narrow, claustrophobic, forcing me to turn sideways and shuffle along in complete darkness. Behind me, I could hear them trying to follow, but their bodies seemed too solid to fit through the gap. The passage opened into a cavern I couldn't see the end of. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, and the air felt different. Older, heavier, sacred. Ancient torches lined the walls, lighting themselves as I passed. The flames cast dancing shadows that looked like warriors, and I realized I wasn't alone in the cavern. The real night marchers were waiting for me. They stood in perfect formation, hundreds of Hawaiian warriors from across the centuries, chiefs and commoners, men and women, all bearing the weapons and regalia of their time. But these weren't the translucent figures I'd seen in the valley. These were solid, real, present. Their leader stepped forward, a massive man wearing a feather cape that seemed to shimmer with its own light. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the cavern like thunder. "You have violated Kapu," he said in perfect English. "You have awakened things that should sleep, but you are not one of them." I fell to my knees, not from reverence but from the weight of his presence. "Please. They took my girlfriend. The fake ones. They took Sarah." The chief studied me with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. "The spirits of the corrupted dead feed on the living. They grow stronger with each soul they claim. Your woman, she is beyond saving." "No." The word came out as a sob. "There has to be something. Please." "There is one way," another warrior said, stepping from the ranks. This one was younger, with intricate tattoos covering his arms. "But the price is high." "Anything." The chief nodded slowly. "You can take her place, offer yourself willingly, and she will be freed. But you will join us, walk the night paths forever." I thought of Sarah, the real Sarah, not the thing wearing her face. I thought of her laugh, the way she'd scrunch her nose when she was thinking hard about something, the way she'd held my hand when we'd seen those first torches in the distance. "I'll do it." The warriors parted, creating a path that led deeper into the cavern. At its heart was a pool of water so still it looked like black glass. The chief gestured toward it. "Drink, and the bargain is sealed. Your soul will join ours, and your woman will be returned to the world of the living." I knelt beside the pool and cupped the water in my hands. It was ice cold, so cold it burned. As I lifted it to my lips, I saw my reflection in the surface, and for just a moment, I looked like one of them. A warrior, painted for battle, ready to march through eternity. I drank. The water tasted like metal and earth and something else, something ancient and powerful that made my body convulse. Fire spread through my veins and I collapsed beside the pool, my vision going dark. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the valley. Sarah stood beside our collapsed tent, whole and human and confused. She spun around when she heard me approaching, her face lighting up with relief. "Mike! Oh God, where have you been? I woke up and you were gone, and our stuff is trashed and—" She stopped mid-sentence, her expression changing as she really looked at me. "Mike, are you okay? You look—" I could see my reflection in her eyes. I looked the same as always, but there was something different, something in my expression, in the way I moved. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." We packed what remained of our gear in silence. Sarah kept glancing at me with growing concern, but she didn't ask questions. Maybe she could sense that some answers were too dangerous to know. The hike out was a blur. The trail was there again, exactly as it should be. The sun rose on schedule. Our phones worked. It was as if the last 3 days had been a nightmare, except for the changes in me. I could feel them watching us as we climbed toward the valley rim. The night marchers, standing in the shadows of the kukui trees, waiting for darkness to fall so they could resume their eternal patrol. I was one of them now, bound to return when my human life ended. But I had saved Sarah. That had to be enough. We made it to the trailhead by noon, and Sarah's first words were about getting to a hospital. "Mike, you need to see a doctor. You've been acting strange and you feel cold. Like, really cold." I managed a smile that felt almost normal. "I'm fine, just tired." But I wasn't fine, and I never would be again. As we drove away from Waimanu Valley, I caught glimpses of myself in the rearview mirror. Sometimes I looked normal. Sometimes I looked like a warrior with intricate tattoos and eyes that held the weight of centuries. The old Hawaiian man was sweeping the porch of his store when we passed through Waipio Valley. He looked up as our rental car went by, and his weathered face went pale. He knew. Somehow, he knew what I'd become. That was 6 months ago. Sarah and I are still together, though she started pulling away. She says I feel different, that sometimes when she looks at me, it's like looking at a stranger. She's not wrong. Every night when the sun sets, I feel the pull. The call to return to Waimanu Valley, to take my place among the night marchers. I fight it, but it gets stronger each time. My human body is just a shell now, a temporary vessel for something much older. I've started making arrangements. Sarah doesn't know yet, but I've been putting my affairs in order. When the pull becomes too strong to resist, I'll go back to the valley one last time. I'll walk the ancient paths with warriors who died centuries ago, protecting sacred ground from those who would defile it. The fake hikers are still there too. I can feel them in my dreams. They whisper that I could join them instead, that the corruption is easier than the honor. But I made my choice beside that black pool, and I'll live with it for whatever time I have left. Sarah deserves better than watching me fade away piece by piece. She deserves someone who can love her without the weight of eternity pressing down on his soul. Someone who won't wake up screaming from dreams of ancient battles and sacred duties. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever find yourself in Hawaii, stay away from Waimanu Valley. Don't camp on sacred ground. Don't ignore the warnings of the kupuna, the elders who remember the old ways. And if you see torches moving in perfect formation through the darkness, don't look too closely at the faces of the warriors carrying them. You might recognize someone you know. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote Waipio Valley on Hawaii's Big Island, where the ancient cliffs meet the endless Pacific and civilization feels like a distant memory. I should have listened to the locals in Honokaa when they warned me about hiking alone into the valley after sunset. But I was desperate to escape the suffocating grief that had followed me across the Pacific like a shadow. My sister Emma had died in a car accident 6 months earlier, and nothing, not therapy, not medication, not the concerned voices of friends, could silence the guilt that whispered in my ear every waking moment. I had been driving that night. I had been the one who suggested we take the mountain road. The Waipio Valley seemed like the perfect place to disappear for a while. Remote, beautiful, and most importantly, empty. The guidebooks called it the Valley of the Kings, where ancient Hawaiian royalty once lived. What they didn't mention was why the locals crossed themselves when they spoke its name after dark. I arrived at the Waipio Valley Lookout just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the massive cliffs in shades of amber and crimson. The valley stretched below me like a green wound in the earth, bisected by a dark river that snaked toward the black sand beach. Waterfalls cascaded down the 1,000-foot cliffs like tears from heaven. My plan was simple. Hike down the treacherous Z-trail to the valley floor, set up camp near the old taro fields, and spend 3 days alone with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of the ocean. I had enough supplies for a week, a satellite communicator for emergencies, and a stubborn determination to confront whatever demons were waiting for me in that isolated paradise. The hike down was brutal. The trail was more like a barely controlled landslide, with loose rocks and mud that threatened to send me tumbling toward the valley floor. My hiking boots slipped constantly on the wet, volcanic soil, and by the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking from the effort. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the valley floor. I found a suitable campsite near the ruins of an old homestead, where crumbling stone walls were slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. The sound of the nearby stream would mask any noise I might make, and the thick canopy of kukui trees provided shelter from the wind that howled down from the cliffs above. As I pitched my tent in the fading light, I noticed something odd about the ruins. The stones were arranged in patterns that didn't match any Hawaiian architecture I'd seen in guidebooks. Strange symbols were carved into some of the larger blocks, spirals and angular shapes that seemed to shift in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at them, they appeared to be nothing more than natural erosion patterns. But when I glanced away, they resumed their unsettling dance. The first night passed without incident, though I slept poorly. The valley was far from silent. The stream gurgled constantly. Nightbirds called to each other across the darkness, and something large crashed through the underbrush every few hours. But it was another sound that kept me awake. A low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I stepped outside my tent to investigate, the chanting stopped, leaving only the natural sounds of the valley. I convinced myself it was just the wind through the cliffs, or perhaps the sound of the ocean waves reaching the shore. The human mind, after all, is remarkable at finding patterns where none exist. The second day began with an unsettling discovery. My water bottles, which I had carefully secured in my backpack the night before, were empty. Not just low, completely drained, as if someone had poured them out during the night. The caps were still screwed on tight and there were no holes in the bottles. I refilled them from the stream, but the incident left me on edge. I spent the morning exploring the valley, following ancient terrace walls that led deeper into the jungle. The vegetation grew thicker as I moved away from the beach, and the air became heavy with moisture and the cloying scent of rotting flowers. Massive ferns created a canopy so dense that noon felt like twilight. It was near one of the larger waterfalls that I first saw her. She was standing motionless at the base of the falls, her back to me, wearing a white dress that seemed to glow against the dark volcanic rock. Her long black hair hung straight and wet, as though she had just emerged from the pool. She was impossibly still, not the natural stillness of someone enjoying a peaceful moment, but the absolute motionlessness of death. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the roar of the waterfall. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I moved closer, my boots squelching in the muddy ground around the pool. The woman remained perfectly still, and as I approached I could see that her dress was not white but rather a pale green, stained with what looked like algae or moss. Her skin had a grayish pallor that made my stomach clench with unease. "Are you okay?" I asked, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment my fingers made contact with the fabric of her dress, she turned. I will never forget her face. It was the face of a beautiful young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with delicate Hawaiian features and large, dark eyes. But those eyes were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just the milky opacity of cataracts or death. Her mouth was open in a perfect circle as though she were screaming, but no sound emerged. Water dripped constantly from her hair and dress, forming dark puddles at her feet. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The woman, or whatever she was, watched me with those horrible white eyes, her mouth still frozen in that silent scream. Then, without warning, she began to walk toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural like a marionette controlled by a drunk puppeteer. I ran. I crashed through the jungle, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my lungs burning as I fought my way back toward my campsite. Behind me, I could hear the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps exactly, but a wet, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the muddy ground. I didn't stop running until I reached my tent, where I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. When I finally worked up the courage to look back toward the waterfall, there was nothing there. No sign of the woman, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Even the muddy footprints I was certain I had left during my panicked flight were nowhere to be seen. But my boots were clean. Impossibly, perfectly clean, despite having just run through several hundred yards of muddy jungle floor. That night, the chanting returned, louder and more distinct than before. It was definitely human voices, multiple voices, singing in what sounded like an ancient Hawaiian dialect. The melody was hauntingly beautiful but filled with a sadness so profound it made my chest ache. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the voices rise and fall in complex harmonies that seemed to come from the very rocks around me. When I could no longer stand the suspense, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The valley was bathed in silvery moonlight, but the light seemed wrong somehow. Too bright, too cold, casting sharp shadows that moved independently of their sources. The chanting continued, and now I could see its source. Dozens of figures standing throughout the valley, some near the stream, others scattered among the taro terraces, still more positioned along the cliff walls where no human could possibly climb. They were all wearing white, and they were all perfectly still except for their mouths, which moved in perfect unison with the haunting melody. Even from a distance, I could see that their eyes were the same milky white as the woman by the waterfall. As I watched, frozen with terror, one of the figures near the stream turned to look directly at me. Then another. Then another. Soon, dozens of white eyes were focused on my small tent, and the chanting began to change. The melody became discordant, angry, filled with a malevolence that made my skin crawl. I dove back into my tent and zipped it shut, my hand shaking so violently I could barely work the zipper. The chanting continued for hours, growing louder and more agitated until I was certain the singers were right outside my tent. I could hear them moving around the perimeter, their wet footsteps squelching in the mud, their voices raised in what was no longer singing but a collective wail of grief and rage. Then, just before dawn, silence fell like a blanket over the valley. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I packed my gear with mechanical efficiency, determined to hike out of the valley before another sunset could trap me with whatever walked among the taro fields after dark. But when I shouldered my backpack and started toward the trail, I discovered that the landscape had changed. The stream, which had run in a straight line from the waterfall to the ocean the day before, now meandered in impossible loops and spirals. The taro terraces were arranged differently, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Even the cliffs seemed to have shifted, their faces now bearing carved symbols that were definitely not natural erosion. Worst of all, I couldn't find the trail. I spent 3 hours searching for the path that led up the cliff face, but it was simply gone. The cliff wall was smooth volcanic rock rising straight up for 1,000 feet, with no sign that a trail had ever existed. I tried following the stream toward the beach, thinking I might find another way out, but the stream led me in circles, always returning me to the same grove of kukui trees near my original campsite. The sun was beginning to set again, and panic was setting in. I tried my satellite communicator, but the device showed no signal, no connection to the outside world. It was as though the valley had become completely isolated from the rest of the universe. As darkness fell, I prepared for another night of terror. But this time, I was determined to be proactive. If something was trying to trap me in this place, I was going to find out what it wanted. I gathered dry wood and built a large fire near the ruins of the old homestead, then sat with my back against one of the carved stones and waited. The chanting began right on schedule, but tonight it sounded different, sadder, more mournful. The white-eyed figures appeared as before, but they kept their distance from my fire, forming a large circle around my campsite. In the flickering firelight, I could see them more clearly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. They weren't strangers. They were people I recognized. There was Mrs. Chen from my apartment building, who had died of cancer the previous year. My high school English teacher, Mr. Patterson, who had suffered a heart attack 5 years ago. My college roommate, Jenny, who had overdosed in our junior year. And there, standing directly across the fire from me, was Emma. My sister looked exactly as she had the night she died. Young, beautiful, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders. But her eyes were that same terrible milky white, and her mouth was open in that silent scream of anguish. "Emma," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. She stepped forward. moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait as the woman by the waterfall. The other figures began to move as well, slowly closing their circle around my fire. Their chanting grew louder, more insistent, and now I could understand some of the words. They were singing about death, about guilt, about the pain of those left behind, about me. Emma stopped just outside the ring of firelight, her white eyes fixed on my face. When she spoke, her voice was like the sound of water running over stones, beautiful and terrible at the same time. "Sarah," she said, and the word carried all the weight of my guilt, all the sleepless nights and self-recrimination that had brought me to this cursed valley. "Why didn't you save me?" "I tried," I sobbed, the words barely coherent through my tears. "I tried to reach you, but the car was crushed and you weren't moving and you were driving," Emma continued, her voice becoming harsher, more accusatory. "You suggested the mountain road. You killed me, Sarah. You killed me, and now you have to pay." The other figures began to close in, their chanting becoming a roar of condemnation. I could smell them now, the cloying sweetness of decay, the metallic tang of old blood. Their white eyes reflected the firelight like mirrors, creating a ring of cold stars around my small island of warmth. But as they drew closer, something inside me rebelled. This wasn't Emma. Emma would never say these things, would never try to hurt me this way. Whatever was wearing my sister's face was feeding on my guilt, using my grief as a weapon against me. "You're not Emma," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "Emma loved me. She would never blame me for what happened." The figure wearing my sister's face snarled, its beautiful features twisting into something monstrous. "I am Emma. I am everyone you've failed to save, everyone you've let down, everyone whose death you've caused." "No," I said, standing up and grabbing a burning branch from the fire. "You're something else, something that feeds on guilt and regret. But I won't let you use my sister's memory against me anymore." I swung the burning branch at the Emma thing, and it shrieked, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. The flame passed right through its form, but where the fire touched, the false Emma began to dissolve, revealing something else underneath. It was ancient and terrible, a creature of shadows and malevolence that had been wearing human faces like masks. As the disguise burned away, I saw glimpses of its true form, writhing tentacles of darkness, eyes like burning coals, a mouth full of teeth like broken obsidian. The other figures began to dissolve as well, their human appearances melting away to reveal the same writhing darkness beneath. The chanting became a cacophony of inhuman shrieks and wails, the sound of something very old and very hungry being denied its meal. I held the burning branch high, turning in a slow circle to keep the creatures at bay. "I know what you are now," I shouted over their screams. "You're a guilt eater, aren't you? You feed on people's regret and self-blame. That's why you were drawn to me, why you trapped me here, but I won't give you what you want anymore." The creature that had worn Emma's face lunged at me, its true form shifting and writhing like smoke. I swung the branch again, and this time the flames caught hold of something solid. The thing screamed and retreated, leaving behind the smell of sulfur and burning decay. "I loved my sister," I continued, tears still streaming down my face but my voice steady now. "And yes, I was driving that night. Yes, I suggested we take the mountain road, but I didn't cause the landslide that killed her. I didn't make it rain. I didn't create the conditions that led to the accident. I was just a person trying to get home safely with someone I loved." With each word, the creatures seemed to grow smaller, less substantial. Their shrieks became whimpers, their terrible forms beginning to fade into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Emma wouldn't want me to carry this guilt forever," I said, and as I spoke the words, I realized they were true. She would want me to live, to be happy, to honor her memory by being the best person I could be, and that's what I'm going to do. The last of the creatures dissolved into shadow and were gone. The valley fell silent except for the natural sounds of the stream and the wind through the trees. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me since I arrived began to lift, and for the first time in months, I could breathe freely. I spent the rest of the night by the fire watching the stars wheel overhead and thinking about Emma, not about her death, but about her life. Her laugh, her terrible jokes, the way she used to steal food off my plate when she thought I wasn't looking. The good memories began to outweigh the bad ones, and I found myself smiling through my tears. When dawn broke over the valley, the trail was back. I could see it clearly, winding up the cliff face toward the lookout where I had left my car 3 days earlier. The stream ran straight from the waterfall to the ocean. The taro terraces were arranged in their original pattern, and the carved symbols on the ruins had faded back into natural erosion patterns. I packed my gear and began the arduous climb out of the valley, my legs still shaky from the night's events but my heart lighter than it had been in months. As I climbed, I could hear the sound of water falling and the distant crash of waves on the beach, but no more chanting, no more supernatural presence watching from the shadows. At the top of the cliff, I turned for one last look at the Waipio Valley. In the morning light, it looked exactly as it had in the guidebooks. Beautiful, serene, a place where ancient Hawaiian royalty had once lived in peace. There was no sign of the horrors I had witnessed, no indication that anything supernatural had ever occurred there. But I knew the truth. The valley was a trap, a place where creatures older than human civilization waited to feed on the guilt and regret of those foolish enough to venture there alone. I had escaped because I had finally learned to forgive myself, to accept that tragedy was not always someone's fault. As I drove away from the valley, heading back toward civilization, I made a decision. I would honor Emma's memory not through guilt and self-recrimination, but through living the life she would have wanted me to live. I would be kind to others, work to make the world a better place, and remember that love, not guilt, was the proper response to loss. But I would never return to the Waipio Valley after dark, and I would make sure that anyone who asked me about hiking there alone would hear the truth about what waited in those shadows between the ancient cliffs. Some places are beautiful during the day but belong to older, hungrier things once the sun goes down. The Valley of the Kings is one of them, and those who choose to ignore the warnings of the locals do so at their own peril. Emma is at peace now, I believe, and for the first time since the accident, so am I. The guilt eaters are still out there, still waiting for the next broken soul to wander into their domain, but they won't find easy prey in me anymore. I've learned that some ghosts can only haunt you if you let them, and the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we create ourselves. The real horror wasn't the creatures in the valley, it was the prison I had built for myself out of guilt and regret. The supernatural entities were just feeding on what I had already done to myself. By learning to forgive myself, I had starved them of their power over me. Now, whenever I feel the old guilt creeping back, I remember that night by the fire when I chose to honor Emma's memory with love instead of self-hatred. It's not always easy, but it's always the right choice. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I swear I can hear Emma's voice whispering words of forgiveness and encouragement. Not the terrible mimicry of the guilt eaters, but the real voice of my sister, reminding me that love is stronger than death, and that the best way to honor those we've lost is to live fully in their memory. The Waipio Valley remains beautiful and terrible, a place where the boundary between our world and older, darker realms grows thin. But I am no longer afraid of it, because I understand now that the real monsters were never in the valley at all. They were in my own heart, and I had the power to banish them all along. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Waiale Valley on the island of Kauai, deep in the interior mountains where the trade winds die and the jungle swallows sound whole. My boyfriend Marcus and I had planned this backpacking trip for months. We were both burned out from our corporate jobs in Honolulu, him from his marketing firm. Me from the law office where I spent my days buried in contracts. The plan was simple. 3 days hiking the ancient trails that wound through the valley's interior, camping under stars we never saw through the city's light pollution, and reconnecting with each other away from the constant ping of notifications. Marcus had found the trail online, posted by some local hiking forum. Hidden gem, the post had called it, untouched by tourists, real old Hawaii. The trailhead began just past the end of a dirt road that branched off Highway 550, near the Koki State Park boundary but technically outside it. No permits required, the post claimed. No crowds. That should have been our first warning. We left Honolulu early Saturday morning, taking the inter-island flight to Lihue, then driving our rental jeep up the winding mountain road as the sun climbed toward noon. The familiar tourist destinations fell behind us. Waimea Canyon, the Kalalau Lookout, until we were following increasingly rough roads marked only by faded mile markers and the occasional rusted sign in both English and Hawaiian. The GPS signal died somewhere around mile marker 17. Marcus laughed it off, consulting the printed map we'd brought as backup. "Old school navigation," he said, flashing that crooked grin that had made me fall for him 3 years ago. When's the last time we actually had to read a real map? I studied the topographical lines, tracing our route with my finger. The trail would take us down into the valley floor, following what looked like an old stream bed, then loop back up the opposite ridge. 3 days total, easy terrain according to the forum post, well-marked trail. The trailhead, when we finally found it, was little more than a gap in the vegetation marked by a single weathered post driven into the red dirt. No trail signs, no information boards, no evidence that the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources had ever acknowledged this place existed. Just that post, carved with symbols I didn't recognize, not the usual trailblazes, but something that looked almost like pictographs. "You sure this is right?" I asked, adjusting my pack straps. The weight felt good, familiar. We'd done enough weekend hikes around Oahu to know our gear. Marcus double-checked the GPS coordinates on his phone before the signal cut out entirely. "This is it. Look, you can see where the trail starts." He pointed past the post, and I could make out what might have been a path winding down through the dense ohia lehua trees and native ferns. The silence struck me immediately as we began our descent. I'd hiked plenty of Hawaiian trails before, but there was always sound. Wind through the leaves, bird calls, the distant crash of waves. Here, the jungle seemed to absorb everything. Our footsteps on the packed earth, the rustle of our packs, even our breathing seemed muffled, swallowed by the green darkness that closed around us. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Marcus said, but his voice sounded strange, smaller somehow. The trail was well-defined at first, clearly maintained, though I never saw any evidence of trail crews or recent maintenance. The vegetation was lush but not overgrown, as if something kept it naturally in check. Ancient guava trees created a canopy overhead, their branches so thick they blocked most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler as we descended, and damper, carrying scents I couldn't identify. Not quite floral, not quite rotting, but something in between. We hiked for 2 hours before the wrongness began to register. "Hey," I called to Marcus, who'd been leading. "Are you seeing any trail markers?" He stopped and looked around. "Now that you mention it, no. But the trail's pretty clear, right?" It was, and that was part of what bothered me. Too clear, too perfect. Like someone had been maintaining it recently, but we hadn't seen a single sign of other hikers. No footprints in the soft patches of earth, no scuff marks on the roots that crossed the path, no discarded energy bar wrappers or any of the other small signs that people had passed this way. "Maybe it's just not a popular trail," Marcus said when I voiced my concern. "Isn't that what we wanted? To get away from the crowds?" We continued deeper into the valley. The stream that was supposed to run parallel to the trail according to our map was nowhere to be seen, though I could swear I heard water running somewhere in the distance. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely in the thick air. By the time we reached what should have been our first camping spot, a small clearing marked on the map, the sun was beginning to set, though it was impossible to tell through the canopy. The clearing was there, exactly as marked, but it felt wrong. Too perfect, like the trail. A circle of flat ground surrounded by trees, with stones arranged in what could have been a fire ring but looked older, more deliberate than something left by casual campers. "Someone's been taking care of this place," I said, running my hand over one of the stones. It was smooth, worn, and warm to the touch despite the cooling air. "Maybe the locals use it," Marcus said, dropping his pack. "Traditional gathering spot or something." We set up our tent as the light faded, working mostly in silence. The usual camping sounds were absent. No insects, no bird calls settling in for the night. Nothing but that distant water sound that seemed to shift direction every time I tried to locate it. Even the wind had died completely. Marcus got our camp stove going while I organized our food for the next 2 days. We'd planned simple meals, dried pasta, instant coffee, energy bars. As the blue flame flickered under our pot of water, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The flame cast shadows around our small circle of light, but the shadows seemed wrong, moving independently of their sources, twisting into shapes that looked almost like figures watching us from the tree line. "Marcus," I said quietly, "look at the shadows." He glanced up from stirring our dinner. "What about them?" I looked again, and they were normal. Just normal shadows cast by normal firelight. Nothing, never mind. But something had shifted in the air around us, something I couldn't name. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against my eardrums. I found myself straining to hear something, anything. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, proof that we weren't alone in a dead world. Dinner was pasta with dried sauce, the same meal we'd eaten on a dozen other camping trips. But it tasted wrong here, metallic and flat. Marcus seemed not to notice, chatting about work gossip and plans for the next day's hike, but his voice sounded strained, like he was forcing the normalcy. "How far to the valley floor tomorrow?" I asked, consulting our map by headlamp light. "Should be easy, maybe 4 miles, then we follow the stream back up the other side." He traced the route with his finger. "There's supposed to be a waterfall about halfway through. The forum post mentioned swimming holes." I nodded, but something about the map bothered me. The contour lines seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if the paper itself was unstable. When I mentioned it to Marcus, he just laughed and said I was getting paranoid from too much screen time back in the city. We crawled into our tent as full darkness settled over the valley. Through the thin nylon walls, the silence was absolute. I lay on my back, staring up at nothing, listening to Marcus's breathing slow into sleep. But sleep wouldn't come for me. Every time I began to drift off, I'd jerk awake with the feeling that someone was standing just outside our tent, listening. Finally, sometime past midnight, I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside to pee. The darkness beyond our small camp was complete. No moon, no stars visible through the canopy, nothing but black air so thick it seemed solid. I used my headlamp to navigate to a tree a decent distance from our tent, but as I was finishing up, the light flickered and died. I stood there in the absolute darkness, fumbling for the spare batteries in my pocket, when I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling our campsite. Not human footsteps, too measured, too rhythmic, like something walking on 2 legs but not quite remembering how. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, just like the water. My hands shook as I finally managed to replace the batteries and click the headlamp back on. Nothing, just trees and ferns and the stone circle of our fire pit, now cold and dark. "Jennifer?" Marcus's voice came from the tent, groggy with sleep. "You okay?" "Fine," I whispered back, but I wasn't fine. As I hurried back to the tent, I could swear I felt eyes following me, watching from the darkness beyond my light's reach. I didn't sleep that night. I lay rigid beside Marcus, listening to nothing, which was somehow worse than listening to something. By the time pale light began filtering through the canopy, I felt like I'd been awake for days. Marcus seemed refreshed when he woke, chattering about the day ahead as he heated water for instant coffee. But I noticed he kept glancing toward the tree line, and his hands trembled slightly as he packed his gear. "You hear anything last night?" I asked casually. "Like what?" "I don't know. Just anything." He paused in rolling up his sleeping bag. "This place is just really quiet, isn't it? Quieter than anywhere I've ever been." We broke camp and continued deeper into the valley. The trail remained perfectly maintained but completely empty of any sign that others had passed this way. My unease grew as we hiked. It wasn't just the silence anymore. It was the sameness. Every tree looked identical to the last. Every turn in the trail felt familiar, as if we were walking in circles despite our compass heading steadily downward. "Marcus, stop," I said around noon. "Look around. Really look." He did, turning slowly in place. I watched his expression change from confusion to something approaching fear. "This is the same grove of trees we passed an hour ago," he said slowly. "That fallen log, the way the ferns are arranged, it's identical." I pulled out our map, but the ink seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on our location. The topographical lines writhed like living things, and the trail we'd marked in red pen faded even as I watched. "The map's wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The whole thing's wrong." That's when we heard the voices. Distant at first, carried on air that hadn't moved all morning. Multiple voices, speaking in what sounded like Hawaiian, but the words were wrong somehow, twisted, like a recording played backward. The voices grew closer, though we could see no one through the trees. Marcus grabbed my hand. "We need to get out of here." But when we turned to retrace our steps back up the trail, it was gone. The perfectly maintained path we'd been following simply ended in thick jungle, as if it had never existed. "This isn't possible," Marcus said, but his voice cracked on the words. The voices were getting closer, and now I could make out individual words, though they made no sense. They seemed to be calling names. Jennifer, Marcus, but in voices that weren't quite human, syllables stretched and distorted. We pushed through the jungle, fighting through ferns and vines that seemed to grab at our clothes and packs. Branches scraped across my face, drawing blood, but I barely felt them. All I could think about was getting away from those voices, which were coming from all directions now, surrounding us. We stumbled into another clearing, smaller than our campsite from the night before. In the center stood a single Ohialehua tree, ancient and massive, its trunk scarred with the same strange symbols we'd seen on the trailhead post. But these symbols seemed to move in my peripheral vision, shifting and changing when I wasn't looking directly at them. "Look," Marcus whispered, pointing. Around the base of the tree were offerings. Fresh offerings. Thai leaves arranged in complex patterns, carved wooden tikis, and other objects I couldn't identify. But what made my blood freeze were the photographs scattered among the traditional items. Polaroids and digital prints, dozens of them, showing hikers and campers in the very clearing where we now stood. I picked up one of the photos with shaking hands. It showed a young couple, maybe early 20s, standing hand in front of the scarred tree. They were smiling, posing for what looked like a normal hiking photo. But their eyes were wrong. Completely black, no iris or pupil visible, just endless darkness. "Jennifer." Marcus's voice was tight with terror. "Look at this one." The photo he held showed our campsite from the previous night, our exact tent, our exact arrangement of gear around the stone fire circle. But the timestamp on the digital print showed a date from 3 years ago. The voices had stopped. The silence pressed against us like a living thing, and I realized we were no longer alone in the clearing. Figures moved between the trees, human-shaped but wrong, their movements too fluid, too synchronized. They appeared to be wearing the faces of other hikers, other campers, but the faces didn't quite fit, like masks stretched over something else entirely. One of them stepped into the clearing, and I recognized the face from one of the photographs. The young man from the couple, but his features had been subtly rearranged, his smile too wide, his head tilted at an impossible angle. "You're early," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." More figures emerged from the jungle. I saw the young woman from the photo, an older man in hiking gear, a family of 4 with their faces slack and empty. All of them wore the expressions of people posing for pictures, frozen smiles that never touched their black eyes. "What do you want?" Marcus managed to ask. The thing wearing the young man's face tilted its head further, vertebrae popping audibly. "Want? We want nothing. We take nothing. We simply maintain." Maintain what? The trail, the clearings, the silence. It gestured to the ancient tree behind us. "This place has been maintained for a very long time. Before the hotels, before the roads, before the ships brought your people here, we maintain it still." I understood then, with a clarity that came with absolute terror. This wasn't a hiking trail. It was a trap, or maybe a preserve, carefully maintained to lure people like us into the valley. The perfect path, the convenient campsites, the forum posts that led us here, all of it designed to bring fresh visitors to this place where time didn't work right and maps couldn't be trusted. "Let us go," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "We'll leave. We won't tell anyone." The thing that had been a young man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Leave? But you've only just arrived, and we've been so lonely, maintaining this place by ourselves." The other figures began to close in, their movements coordinated like a dance they'd performed many times before. Their faces were wrong in different ways, some too symmetrical, others with features that didn't quite align, all with those same empty black eyes. Marcus pulled out his pocket knife, the blade looking pitiful against what surrounded us. "Stay back." "You misunderstand," the lead figure said patiently. "We're not going to hurt you. We're going to help you. Help you join the maintenance crew." That's when I saw them. More photographs scattered around the tree's base that I'd missed before. Recent ones. A hiking couple that looked familiar from missing person reports I'd seen on the local news. A solo backpacker who'd disappeared near Koki Park 6 months ago. All with those same black eyes, those same slack smiles. "Run," I whispered to Marcus. We bolted simultaneously, crashing through the circle of not-quite-human figures. I felt cold fingers brush my arm as we passed and heard that glass-breaking laughter echoing behind us. We plunged into the jungle, fighting through vegetation that seemed to actively resist our passage, branches whipping across our faces and roots trying to trip us with deliberate malice. Behind us, the voices started up again, but now they were calling our names in our own voices. Marcus calling for Jennifer, Jennifer calling for Marcus, the sounds bouncing and echoing through the trees until I couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. We ran for what felt like hours, our packs bouncing and tearing on branches, our water bottles and gear scattering behind us. The jungle began to thin, and I caught glimpses of sky through the canopy. Real sky, with real clouds, not the dead gray ceiling that had pressed down on us in the valley. Finally, we burst out of the tree line onto a familiar dirt road. Highway 550, though we were miles from where we'd parked. The sudden return to the normal world was so jarring I stumbled and fell, scraping my palms on the asphalt. Marcus pulled out his phone. The signal was weak but present, and the GPS showed our location. We were 15 miles from our rental car, but we were back in the real world where maps worked and time moved forward and the silence didn't have weight. We flagged down a park ranger's truck an hour later. The ranger, a local man named Keone, listened to our story with the expression that grew increasingly grim. "Whale Valley," he said when we finished. "You're not the first to come out of there with stories like this. Won't be the last either." "Then why don't you close it off? Put up warning signs?" Keone shook his head. can't close off what officially doesn't exist. That trail you found? It's not on any of our maps. Never has been. But every few months someone finds it anyway. Usually they don't come back out. He drove us back to our car, and we drove straight to the airport without stopping at our hotel. I wanted off the island. Wanted to put as much distance as possible between us and that valley where silence had weight and photographs showed impossible things. On the plane back to Honolulu, Marcus pulled out his phone to delete the few pictures he'd taken at the trailhead. But when he opened his photo app, there were dozens of images he hadn't taken. Pictures of us setting up camp, eating dinner, sleeping in our tent, all time-stamped from years before we'd ever been to Kauai. In the last photo, we were standing in that clearing by the ancient tree, smiling at the camera with eyes gone completely black. Marcus deleted all the photos and threw his phone away at the Honolulu airport. We broke up 2 weeks later, not from any argument or anger, but because every time we looked at each other, we saw those black eyes from the photographs. Every silence between us felt heavy, weighted with memories of that place where time didn't work right. I still dream about the valley sometimes. In the dreams, I'm back on that perfect trail, following the path deeper and deeper into the green darkness. And in the dreams, I'm smiling that same empty smile, and my eyes are black holes that reflect nothing. The worst part is, in the dreams, I'm happy to be back. Happy to be part of the maintenance crew, keeping the trail clear and the campsites ready for the next group of hikers who follow their GPS to coordinates that shouldn't exist, who trust forum posts written by things that wear human faces like poorly fitting masks. Sometimes I check those hiking forums looking for posts about hidden trails on Kauai. They're still there, written in perfect English by users with generic names and no post history. The photos they share show pristine wilderness, perfect campsites, trails that look well-maintained but empty, and sometimes, in the backgrounds of those photos, I see figures standing just at the edge of the frame, figures with familiar faces and black eyes, smiling their frozen smiles as they wait for the next visitors to find their way into Waiale Valley, where the silence has weight and photographs show the truth about what happens to people who stray too far from the marked trails. I've never gone hiking again. I can't trust that any trail I find will lead where the map says it will, or that the people I might meet on the trail are really people at all. Because I know now that there are places in this world that exist in the spaces between the official maps, places maintained by things that were never human but remember what it was like to be. And they're always looking for help with the maintenance. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote Lama Valley on the big island of Hawaii, deep in the Kohala Mountains where the old-growth forest still whispers secrets that should stay buried. I should have listened to the locals in Waimea when they warned us about the valley. Should have paid attention when old Keone at the general store shook his head and muttered something in Hawaiian about aqua mino, evil spirits, when my boyfriend Marcus mentioned our hiking plans. But we were young, confident, and desperate to escape the suffocating weight of our failing relationship with one last adventure. Marcus had found the trail online, boasting about discovering an untouched paradise that most tourists never see. The Lama Valley Trail supposedly led to ancient Hawaiian ruins and pristine waterfalls, accessible only through a grueling 2-day hike through dense rainforest. Perfect for his Instagram feed and his need to prove he was still the adventurous man I'd fallen for 3 years ago. We started our hike at dawn on a Thursday in October, the air thick with humidity that clung to our skin like a second layer. The trailhead sat at the end of a barely maintained dirt road, marked only by a weathered sign warning hikers about flash floods and unstable terrain. No cell service for miles, something Marcus celebrated as getting back to nature, while I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through stands of native koa trees and tree ferns that created a green cathedral overhead. Marcus led the way, his expensive hiking boots crunching on fallen leaves while I followed, my anxiety manifesting as an obsessive need to check and recheck our supplies. 2 days' worth of food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, emergency beacon, everything we needed for a safe trip. Except safety was already slipping away from us, one subtle wrongness at a time. The first sign came after 2 hours of hiking when we reached what should have been a stream crossing according to our GPS. Instead, we found only a dry riverbed filled with smooth black stones that clicked together unnaturally when disturbed by our footsteps. The sound reminded me of teeth chattering, though the morning was warm and humid. "That's weird," Marcus said, checking his phone. "The satellite imagery showed water here." I knelt beside the empty channel, running my fingers through the volcanic sand. It felt cold, much colder than it should have in the tropical heat. When I lifted my hand, the black grains clung to my palm like they were magnetized to my skin. "Maybe it's seasonal," I offered, though something about the dry stream bed felt deliberately wrong, as if the water had been taken, rather than simply evaporated. We continued deeper into the valley, following a path that seemed to shift subtly when we weren't looking directly at it. I found myself constantly readjusting our direction, convinced we were veering off course even though Marcus insisted we were following the trail markers. The metal blazes nailed to trees appeared and disappeared like visual illusions, there one moment and gone the next when I turned back to double-check. By midday, the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. No bird calls, no insect hum, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even our own voices seemed muffled, as if the jungle was absorbing sound before it could travel far. Marcus chatted nervously about work, his law firm, anything to fill the oppressive silence, but his words felt thin and insignificant against the weight of watching trees. Yes, watching. I know how that sounds, but I swear the massive ohia trees were tracking our movement with an awareness that made my skin crawl. Their twisted branches creaked in wind that I couldn't feel, and their dark bark seemed to shift and flow when glimpsed peripherally. "Jen, you're being paranoid," Marcus said when I mentioned the sensation of being observed. "It's just culture shock. You're not used to this kind of wilderness." But I was used to wilderness. I'd grown up camping with my father in the Oregon Cascades, had backpacked through sections of the Pacific Crest Trail. I knew the difference between natural forest sounds and the suffocating wrongness that pressed against us as we descended deeper into Lama Valley. We made camp that evening in a small clearing beside what our map indicated was the valley's main stream. But, like the crossing earlier, we found only another empty channel filled with those unsettling black stones. Marcus set up our tent while I gathered deadfall for a fire, my movements increasingly frantic as daylight faded faster than seemed natural. The sun didn't set so much as vanish, leaving us in absolute darkness punctuated only by the weak glow of our headlamps. I'd never experienced such complete blackness. Not even deep wilderness typically blocked out starlight so thoroughly. When I tilted my head back, expecting to see the brilliant star field that Hawaii is famous for, I found only an empty void that seemed to press down on us like a physical weight. Our fire wouldn't light. I tried 3 different fire-starting methods while Marcus held the flashlight, but every flame died within seconds of catching. The wood wasn't wet. I'd carefully selected dry branches and tinder, but something was actively snuffing out our attempts at warmth and light. "Maybe it's the humidity," Marcus suggested, though I could hear the strain in his voice. He was feeling it too, the sense that we were unwelcome here. We ate a cold dinner of energy bars and trail mix, huddled together in our tent while strange sounds echoed from the forest around us. Not animal sounds. I would have recognized those. These were mechanical clicks and whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves, as if the forest was talking about us in a language older than human speech. I must have dozed sometime after midnight, because I woke to Marcus shaking my shoulder urgently. "Jen, wake up. Something's wrong with the tent." I opened my eyes to discover that our tent was glowing, not from any light source we'd brought, but from the fabric itself, emanating a sickly green phosphorescence that turned Marcus's face into a ghoulish mask. The glow pulsed in a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. "What the hell?" I whispered, reaching for my headlamp. The artificial light revealed that the tent's interior had changed. The familiar blue nylon walls now displayed patterns that definitely hadn't been there when we'd set up camp. Intricate geometric designs that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. They looked almost like ancient petroglyphs, but ones that depicted scenes too disturbing to fully comprehend. Stick figures engaged in acts of ritual violence, spirals that drew the eye inward until looking at them became physically painful, symbols that my mind refused to process completely. "We need to get out of here," I said, already stuffing my sleeping bag into its compression sack. But when Marcus unzipped the tent door, we discovered that getting out wasn't going to be simple. The forest had moved closer during the night, trees that had been 20 feet away when we'd made camp now pressed against the tent's outer walls. Massive trunk circumferences that would have taken several people holding hands to encircle blocked what had been our clear camping space. "This is impossible," Marcus muttered, playing his flashlight beam over bark that seemed to writhe and shift in the light. "Trees don't just relocate overnight." I wanted to agree with him, to find a rational explanation for what we were seeing. But the evidence was undeniable. We were trapped in a pocket of space no larger than our tent, surrounded by a forest that had rearranged itself while we slept. We spent the rest of the night awake, pressed together in the center of our glowing tent, while inhuman sounds echoed from just beyond the fabric walls. Scratching, snuffling, wet sliding sounds that suggested something large was circling our shelter. Occasionally, shadows would pass between the tent and whatever was causing the phosphorescent glow, creating moving silhouettes that looked almost human but wrong in fundamental ways. Too tall, limbs bent at impossible angles, heads that turned completely around on their necks. Dawn came abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch. One moment we were in absolute darkness pierced only by our tent's eerie glow. The next we were squinting in normal tropical sunlight filtering through a forest that had returned to its previous configuration. The trees stood where they belonged, our camping space was clear, and the tent showed no trace of the disturbing patterns that had covered its walls hours earlier. "Bad dream," Marcus said firmly, as if saying it would make it true. Shared hallucination brought on by stress and unfamiliar environment. But I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he flinched when shadows moved in his peripheral vision. And I knew what I'd experienced was no dream when I found the evidence. Deep gouges in the earth around our tent site, as if something with claws the size of railroad spikes had been pacing circles around us all night. We broke camp quickly and continued deeper into the valley, driven by an unspoken agreement that retreat might be more dangerous than moving forward. The trail, if it could still be called that, led steadily downward through increasingly dense vegetation. Massive tree ferns created a canopy so thick that we needed headlamps even at midday, and the air grew thick with moisture that tasted metallic on the tongue. It was Marcus who first noticed that our supplies were disappearing. "Where's the water purification kit?" he asked, digging through his pack during our lunch break. I helped him search, but the small plastic container with our purification tablets had vanished completely. Not misplaced, gone, as if it had never existed. We retraced our morning's hike, checking every spot where we'd stopped to rest, but found nothing. An hour later, my first aid kit disappeared from my pack's outer pocket. Then our backup flashlight, our emergency flares. One by one, the items we needed most for survival were simply ceasing to exist, leaving behind only the faint impression of their shapes in the fabric where they'd been stored. "Someone's following us," Marcus said, scanning the forest around us with growing paranoia. "Taking our stuff while we're not looking." But I knew better. No human thief could have removed items from sealed pockets without us noticing, especially not while we were wearing the packs. Something else was systematically stripping away our ability to survive in the wilderness, leaving us increasingly vulnerable and dependent on finding our way out of the valley. That's when we found the village. It appeared suddenly as we crested a ridge, spread out in the valley floor below us like something from a fever dream. At first glance, it looked like a typical abandoned Hawaiian settlement. Maybe 20 structures built from native wood and stone, arranged around a central plaza where a massive banyan tree spread its canopy. But as we got closer, the wrongness became apparent. The buildings were too old and too new simultaneously. The wood showed centuries of weather damage, warped and gray and covered with moss, but the construction techniques were modern. Machine-cut lumber, galvanized nails, architectural styles that belonged to the 20th century rather than traditional Hawaiian building methods. And there were fresh footprints in the dirt around the buildings. Bare human feet, but wrong somehow. Too long, with toe impressions that looked more like claws than human digits. "Hello," Marcus called out as we entered the village perimeter. "Anyone here?" His voice echoed strangely in the open space, multiplying and distorting until it sounded like a dozen different people were calling out in harmony. The sound made my teeth ache and sent shivers down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. We explored several of the structures, finding them empty but recently occupied. Fresh food scraps, still warm fire pits, sleeping areas that looked like they'd been used within hours of our arrival. But no sign of whoever lived here, despite the evidence of active habitation. The largest building, positioned at the center of the plaza, drew us like a magnet. Its double doors stood slightly ajar, revealing an interior lost in shadows that our flashlight beams couldn't fully penetrate. Against every survival instinct screaming in my head, we approached and pushed the doors open wider. Inside was a single massive room with a high ceiling supported by hand-carved wooden beams. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with photographs, thousands of them, ranging from faded sepia prints to modern digital images. All showed people in outdoor settings, hikers, campers, hunters, families on vacation. But something was wrong with every single photograph. The people in the images looked terrified. Not the casual fear of a surprise photo or embarrassment at being caught off guard, but genuine, gut-deep terror. Their eyes were wide with panic, mouths open in silent screams, bodies positioned as if they were trying to flee from whoever was taking the picture. Many of the photos showed people with obvious injuries, torn clothing, bleeding wounds, expressions of agony that suggested they were in the process of being hurt when the camera captured them. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, playing his flashlight over wall after wall of horror. "What is this place?" I was studying one particular photograph, a recent digital print that showed a young couple in hiking gear. The woman looked exactly like my sister Sarah, down to the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But Sarah lived in Portland and had never been to Hawaii, and the terror in her photographed face was so intense it made my stomach clench with sympathetic fear. That's when I noticed the photographs were changing. Subtle at first, a shift in lighting, a slight movement in the subject's positions. But as I watched, the people in the pictures began to move more dramatically, turning their heads to look directly at me, reaching out with desperate hands as if trying to escape their two-dimensional prisons. "Marcus," I said, backing toward the door, "we need to leave, now." But Marcus was transfixed by something on the far wall. When I followed his gaze, I saw what had captured his attention, a photograph of the two of us, taken sometime that morning while we'd been hiking. We were clearly visible in sharp detail, walking single file down the trail, but our faces showed the same expression of terror that characterized every other image in the room. In the photograph, we were screaming. We ran. I don't remember making the conscious decision to flee, but suddenly we were sprinting through the village plaza while inhuman laughter echoed from the buildings around us. Not the laughter of hidden people watching our panic, but something that seemed to come from the structures themselves, as if the wood and stone were finding our terror amusing. We crashed through the forest on the far side of the settlement, following what might have been a trail or might have been a game path or might have been nothing more than our panicked imaginations. Branches tore at our clothes and skin while we ran blindly through undergrowth that seemed designed to trap and slow us down. Behind us, something was giving chase. I could hear it crashing through the vegetation, keeping pace with us easily despite our desperate speed. It sounded large, very large, and moved with a fluid grace that suggested it was completely at home in this environment while we were clumsy intruders. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, a dark shape flowing between trees like liquid shadow, always just out of direct sight. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing in a small clearing beside yet another dry stream bed. Marcus was pale and shaking, his expensive outdoor gear torn and muddy, his confidence completely shattered. "What was that place?" he gasped between ragged breaths. "What were those pictures?" I wanted to comfort him, to provide a rational explanation that would make sense of what we'd experienced. But rational thought was a luxury we couldn't afford when something inhuman was hunting us through a forest that followed different rules than the natural world we knew. "We need to find a way out of this valley," I said, checking our remaining supplies. Most of our gear had vanished during our flight through the forest, leaving us with only the basics: a water bottle each, some energy bars, one working flashlight, and the clothes on our backs. The sun was setting again. That unnaturally fast, tropical sunset that seemed to flip the world from day to night without transition. We had no shelter, no fire, and no weapons beyond a small folding knife on Marcus's belt. But staying in the open felt safer than seeking cover in a forest that might rearrange itself around us while we slept. We huddled together on the rocky ground, taking turns staying awake to watch for threats. The night sounds were different here, less like a living forest and more like mechanical processes grinding away in the darkness. Clicks and whirs and low humming sounds that suggested machinery buried beneath the earth. It was during my watch, sometime around what I estimated to be 3 a.m., that I saw the lights. They started as small points of phosphorescence moving through the trees, like oversized fireflies tracing random patterns in the air. But as they drew closer to our position, the lights revealed themselves to be something far more disturbing. Human-shaped figures glowing with the same sickly green radiance that had infected our tent the previous night. The figures moved with inhuman grace, gliding between trees without disturbing the undergrowth. As they circled our makeshift camp, I could see them more clearly. They had once been people, but something had changed them in fundamental ways. Their limbs were elongated and moved in directions that should have been impossible for human joints. Their faces were stretched and distorted, with eyes that glowed like hot coals and mouths that opened far too wide to reveal rows of sharp teeth. They were speaking to each other in voices that sounded like wind through dry leaves, using what might have been Hawaiian words but pronounced in ways that hurt to hear. I caught fragments that almost made sense. Malihini for stranger, Pilikia for trouble, but twisted into something that felt like a curse being pronounced over our heads. One of the figures approached closer than the others, and I got a clear look at what had once been human. It wore the remains of hiking clothes similar to ours, suggesting it had once been a person like us who'd made the mistake of entering Lama Valley. But whatever had claimed it had stretched and warped its body into something that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrifyingly wrong. The creature, I couldn't think of it as human anymore, tilted its head at an angle that would have snapped a normal person's neck and spoke directly to me in a voice like breaking glass. "Aloha, Malihini. Welcome to our sacred valley. You have been chosen." I shook Marcus awake, but when he opened his eyes, the glowing figures had vanished. All that remained was the faint scent of plumeria mixed with something that smelled like rotting meat, and the certain knowledge that we were no longer alone in the darkness. "We have to keep moving," I whispered. "They're coming for us." We stumbled through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness, guided only by our failing flashlight and a desperate hope that we could find our way back to the trailhead. But the valley had changed again during the night. Streams that hadn't existed before cut across our path, forcing us to make time-consuming detours. Ridgelines appeared where our map showed flat ground. The trail markers had vanished completely, leaving us to navigate by guesswork through increasingly hostile terrain. It was Marcus who disappeared first. We were crossing a narrow stream on fallen logs when I heard him slip and fall into the water behind me. I turned around expecting to see him picking himself up from the shallow creek, probably cursing about his expensive boots getting soaked. Instead, I found only empty water flowing over smooth stones. "Marcus," I called, scanning the stream in both directions. "Marcus!" No response. No sign that anyone had ever been there. Even the splash I'd heard was already being erased by the current, leaving no ripples or disturbance to mark where he'd fallen. I spent the rest of that day searching for him, following the stream in both directions, calling his name until my voice was raw. But the forest swallowed my shouts without echo, and Marcus remained gone as if he'd never existed. As the second night approached, I was forced to accept that I was alone in a valley that hunted its visitors. My supplies were down to a few energy bars and less than half a bottle of water. My phone had died completely, the battery drained by something that drew power faster than any normal electronic device should consume it. The GPS unit showed only static, and our paper map had begun displaying locations that didn't match the actual terrain. I found shelter in a shallow cave formed by an overhang of volcanic rock, positioning myself where I could watch the approaches while maintaining some protection from the elements. The cave smelled of sulfur and something organic that had been rotting for a very long time, but it was defensible and hidden from casual observation. That's where I was hiding when Marcus came back. I heard his voice first, calling my name from somewhere in the forest below my position. He sounded normal, tired and frightened, but recognizably human. Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I almost abandoned my hiding place immediately to run to him. But something made me pause. Maybe it was the way his voice carried too clearly through the forest, or the fact that he was calling Jennifer instead of the Jen he'd used for 3 years. Or maybe it was the simple impossibility of him finding me when I'd spent hours searching the area where he'd vanished without discovering any trace. I stayed hidden and watched as the thing wearing Marcus's face emerged into the clearing below my cave. It looked exactly like him. Same height, same build, same clothing torn and stained from our ordeal in the forest. But it moved wrong, placing its feet with mechanical precision and turning its head in small, jerky movements like a bird scanning for threats. When it called my name again, I could see that its mouth didn't quite sync with the sound, as if someone was playing a recording through speakers hidden in its throat. "Jennifer," it called, and this time I was certain the voice was too perfect, like a digital reproduction of Marcus rather than the real thing. "I found the way out. We can go home now." The thing that looked like Marcus began searching the area around the clearing, methodically checking behind every tree and boulder. Its movements were systematic and inhuman, lacking the randomness of genuine human behavior. When it approached the base of the cliff where I was hiding, I could see its face clearly for the first time. The features were Marcus's, but the expression was wrong. The eyes were too bright, too alert, lacking the fatigue and fear that should have marked someone who'd been lost in hostile wilderness. The smile was too wide and too constant, never varying despite the changing circumstances. Most disturbing of all, it never blinked. Not once during the entire time I observed it. "I know you're here. Jennifer," it said, staring directly up at my hiding place, though I was certain I was invisible in the shadows. "Come down so we can leave this place together." I pressed myself deeper into the cave, praying that the sulfurous smell would mask my scent from whatever senses the creature was using to track me. My heart was beating so loudly I was convinced it could hear it, but I forced myself to remain motionless while it continued its systematic search. After what felt like hours, the false Marcus moved on, disappearing into the forest while continuing to call my name in that perfect, inhuman voice. I waited until I could no longer hear it before emerging from my hiding place, shaking with a combination of terror and grief. The real Marcus was gone, replaced by something that wore his appearance like a mask, and I was truly alone in a valley that fed on human suffering. I spent the third night moving constantly, afraid to stay in one place long enough for the hunters to locate me. The forest was alive with movement and sound, whispers in dead languages, footsteps that always seemed to be just out of sight, lights that flickered between the trees like eyes opening and closing in the darkness. Several times I encountered other versions of people I'd known. My sister Sarah appeared on a ridge above me, calling for help in a voice thick with pain. My college roommate, Lisa, stumbled out of the undergrowth, bleeding from wounds that looked fresh and terrible. My father stood at the edge of a stream, reaching out his hand and promising to take me home to safety. But I'd learned to recognize the signs. The two perfect voices, the mechanical movements, the expressions that never quite matched the words being spoken. Each false person was a trap designed to exploit my loneliness and desperation, luring me close enough for whatever controlled them to add me to their collection. By the fourth day, I was hallucinating from dehydration and exhaustion. The boundary between reality and nightmare had dissolved completely, leaving me stumbling through a forest populated by memories and fears given physical form. I knew I was dying. Could feel my body shutting down as my water ran out and my energy reserves were exhausted. That's when I found the real trail. It appeared suddenly as I crested a ridge, cutting across the landscape in a perfectly straight line that ignored the natural contours of the terrain. The path was paved with black volcanic stone and marked with metal blazes that showed no sign of weather damage despite being in one of the wettest climates on Earth. I knew it was another trap, another false hope designed to draw me deeper into the valley's web, but I was beyond caring about traps. Death by deception seemed preferable to death by slow starvation, and at least following the trail would give my final hours some sense of purpose. The stone path led steadily upward, climbing toward what I hoped was the valley's rim and possible escape. As I climbed, the forest around me began to change. The twisted trees and impossible vegetation gave way to more normal tropical flora, native Hawaiian plants that belonged in this environment rather than the alien growths that had dominated the deeper valley. The air grew cleaner too, losing the metallic taste and sulfurous smell that had characterized the lower elevations. For the first time in days, I could hear normal forest sounds: bird calls, insect hum, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I was beginning to believe I might actually escape when I reached the top of the ridge and saw what waited for me there. The trail ended at a structure that defied easy description: part ancient Hawaiian temple, part modern observatory, part something that belonged to no human culture I'd ever encountered. Massive stone blocks formed the foundation, carved with petroglyphs that seemed to move and shift when viewed directly. Above the stone base rose a framework of metal and glass that pulsed with the same sickly phosphorescence I'd seen throughout the valley. And standing in front of the structure, waiting for me with infinite patience, was every person I'd seen in the valley: the false Marcus, the glowing figures from the forest, the twisted versions of my friends and family. They formed a semicircle around the trail's terminus, watching me with expressions that ranged from hungry anticipation to something that might have been pity. At the center of the group stood something that had once been human, but had transcended that limitation through centuries of feeding on fear and suffering. It was tall and thin to the point of emaciation, with skin that had turned translucent enough to show the dark fluid that flowed through its veins. When it spoke, its voice contained harmonics that made my bones ache. "Welcome, Jennifer Williams," it said, and hearing my full name from that inhuman throat made my skin crawl. "You have traveled far to reach our sacred place." I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The trail behind me had vanished, replaced by a sheer cliff that dropped into darkness. The only path forward led through the assembled crowd of creatures that had once been human. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, surprised that I could still speak. The creature that might have been the valley's guardian, or its master, or something else entirely, smiled with too many teeth. "We are collectors, Jennifer Williams. We preserve the essence of those who enter our domain, keeping their fear and pain fresh for eternity. You will join our family. become part of our eternal harvest. It gestured toward the structure behind it, and I could see movement in the metal and glass framework. Human shapes trapped within the walls like insects in amber, their faces frozen in expressions of terminal terror. "Your friend Marcus has already accepted our gift," the creature continued. "He fights no longer, has embraced the peace of surrender. You will find the same relief when you stop struggling against your fate." But I hadn't survived 4 days in hell to give up when escape might still be possible. While the creature spoke, I'd been studying the assembled crowd, looking for weaknesses or gaps in their formation. Most of them were focused on their master's words, paying less attention to my movements. I still had Marcus's folding knife in my pocket. Somehow it had been the one piece of equipment that hadn't vanished during our ordeal. The blade was small, barely 3 inches long, but it was sharp, and it was real steel that had existed outside the valley's influence. When the creature reached out with one elongated hand to claim me, I struck. The knife bit deep into what passed for its wrist, and the thing shrieked with a sound like breaking crystal. Dark fluid sprayed from the wound, hissing where it hit the stone ground and filling the air with the smell of burning sulfur. The creature staggered backward, clutching its wounded arm, and for the first time since I'd entered the valley, I saw genuine surprise on an inhuman face. "Iron," it hissed. "Cold iron in our sacred place. Impossible." But the wound was real, and the creature's grip on its assembled minions seemed to weaken with its injury. The false humans began to flicker and fade like images on a malfunctioning television screen, their perfect disguises revealing the twisted forms beneath. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. While the creatures were distracted by their master's pain, I ran toward the structure, hoping to find another way out or at least a defensible position where I could make a final stand. The building's interior was even more disturbing than its exterior had suggested. The walls were lined with what I initially took for windows, but which revealed themselves to be viewing ports into individual cells where the valley's previous victims were suspended in some kind of preservative fluid. Their eyes tracked my movement as I passed, and their mouths moved in silent screams or pleas for help. I found Marcus in the 3rd cell I checked, floating in green liquid with tubes and wires attached to various parts of his body. His eyes met mine through the transparent barrier, and I could see the real Marcus still existed inside whatever the creatures had done to him. He was trying to communicate something, mouthing words I couldn't understand through the fluid. Then I noticed what he was pointing at, a control panel covered with switches and dials that looked almost human in design. If the creatures had built this place to harvest and preserve human fear, they might have included manual overrides in case their automated systems malfunctioned. I began throwing switches at random, hoping to disrupt whatever process was keeping the victims imprisoned. Alarms began sounding throughout the structure, and the phosphorescent glow that provided illumination began to flicker and dim. Behind me, I could hear the creatures trying to force their way into the building, their inhuman voices raised in anger and desperation. Whatever I was doing was causing them significant distress, which meant I was probably on the right track. The cell containing Marcus began to drain, the green fluid flowing away through hidden channels. As the level dropped, he began to move more freely, struggling against the restraints that held him suspended. When the cell was empty, he managed to tear free of the tubes and wires, collapsing to the floor of his prison while gasping for air. "Jen," he croaked, his voice barely recognizable after days of whatever the creatures had done to him. "The others, you have to free the others." I looked around the room at dozens of cells, each containing a human being preserved in artificial suspension. Some looked recent, their clothing and appearance suggesting they'd been captured within the last few months. Others appeared to have been there much longer. Their hair had grown to impossible lengths, and their skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality that suggested decades of imprisonment. "I don't know how," I said, frantically searching the control panel for anything that might release all the cells simultaneously. That's when Marcus, drawing on reserves of strength I didn't know he possessed, dragged himself to a second control panel I hadn't noticed. With shaking hands, he began entering what looked like a sequence of commands, his fingers moving with surprising certainty across the unfamiliar controls. "I learned while I was in there," he gasped. "They forced me to watch, to understand how their system works. They wanted me to fear it." Cell doors began opening throughout the room, releasing streams of preservation fluid and the people who had been suspended within. Most collapsed immediately, too weak from their imprisonment to stand, but a few managed to remain upright long enough to help their fellow prisoners. The building shuddered around us as whatever power source maintained it began to destabilize. Through the walls, I could hear the creatures outside becoming increasingly frantic, their master's injured cries growing weaker as its hold over the valley diminished. "We need to get out of here," Marcus said, supporting himself against the wall. "This whole place is going to collapse." But our escape route was blocked by the assembled creatures who had finally managed to force their way into the building. They moved differently now, less coordinated, more desperate, as if their master's injury had broken their unified purpose. Some attacked each other rather than pursuing us, while others seemed to forget why they were there and wandered aimlessly through the corridors. We gathered the prisoners who were strong enough to move and began searching for another exit. The building was larger than it had appeared from outside, with corridors that branched off in directions that didn't match its external architecture. But we kept moving, following a flow of fresh air that suggested a connection to the outside world. We found our way out through what had once been a loading dock, emerging into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the artificial illumination of the creature's prison. The valley spread out below us, but it looked different now, more like a normal Hawaiian landscape and less like the twisted nightmare we'd been trapped in. Behind us, the structure was collapsing in on itself, the metal framework folding like origami while the stone foundation sank into the earth as if the ground was quicksand. The phosphorescent glow was fading, taking with it the unnatural wrongness that had permeated the entire valley. Most of the rescued prisoners were in shock, unable to process what they'd experienced or where they were now. But a few remembered enough to guide us toward what they claimed was the real trail out of the valley. Not the stone path that had led to our near doom, but a narrow dirt track that switchbacked up the valley walls toward the outside world. The climb took most of the day, with frequent stops to rest and help those who were too weak to maintain the pace. But gradually, the vegetation around us returned to normal, and we began to encounter signs of human civilization. Old trail markers, abandoned campsites, even a few pieces of litter that had never looked so welcome. We reached the parking area where Marcus and I had left our car just as the sun was setting. The vehicle looked exactly as we'd left it, covered with a light coating of dust that suggested it had been sitting undisturbed for several days. But when I checked my phone, which had somehow regained power during our escape, I discovered that only 6 hours had passed since we'd started our hike that morning. 6 hours. Not the 4 days of hell we'd experienced in the valley, but less than a single day in the real world. Time had moved differently in that place, or perhaps hadn't moved at all, trapping us in a pocket of existence where the normal rules didn't apply. Most of the rescued prisoners scattered immediately, desperate to return to their lives and forget what they'd experienced. They wouldn't talk about where they'd been or how long they'd been missing from the outside world. But a few stayed long enough to share fragments of their stories. Hikers and campers who'd vanished in Hawaii over the past several decades, all drawn to remote areas by false trails and deceptive information found online. Marcus and I drove back to our hotel in silence, both of us struggling to process what we'd been through. The physical evidence was minimal. Scratches and bruises that could have been explained by a routine hiking accident, clothes torn by normal underbrush, mild dehydration that suggested a day in the sun rather than days of supernatural torture. But the psychological scars were deeper. Marcus couldn't sleep without sedatives, haunted by dreams of floating in green fluid while inhuman voices whispered in his ears. I found myself unable to enter dark spaces, my claustrophobia triggered by memories of the cave where I'd hidden from the thing wearing his face. We tried to report what we'd found to local authorities, but our story was dismissed as heat exhaustion and hallucinations brought on by dehydration. The Lama Valley didn't exist on any official maps, and the trailhead where we'd started our hike had vanished as completely as if it had never been there. When we searched online for the website Marcus had found with information about the trail, we discovered that it too had disappeared. Not just taken down or moved to a different server, but erased so thoroughly that even archived versions were no longer accessible. Whatever intelligence controlled the valley was careful to cover its tracks, leaving no evidence that might attract unwanted attention. We returned to the mainland 3 days later, our relationship forever changed by what we'd endured together. The man who'd wanted to prove his adventurous spirit had been replaced by someone who flinched at shadows and checked locks obsessively. The woman who'd thought she could handle any wilderness had learned that some places existed outside human understanding or control. But we'd survived. We'd escaped from a hell designed to feed on human suffering and had even managed to free others from the same fate. The creature that had ruled the valley might not be dead. Cold iron could wound it, but probably couldn't destroy something that had existed for centuries. But its power was broken, at least temporarily. Sometimes, late at night when the sedatives aren't working and the nightmares feel too real, I research disappearances in remote areas of Hawaii. Missing hikers whose cases were never solved, experienced outdoors people who vanished without a trace in places they should have known well. The numbers are higher than they should be, clustered around certain locations that appear and disappear from hiking websites with suspicious regularity. I found references to other valleys, other places where the boundaries between the human world and something older and hungrier grow thin. The Lama Valley wasn't unique. It was just one node in a network of predatory locations that span the islands, maybe the entire Pacific. The thing that calls itself the Guardian mentioned others like it, collectors who preserve human fear for purposes I can't begin to understand. They're still out there, still hunting, still feeding on the terror of people who venture too far from the safety of civilization. But they're more careful now. The false websites are harder to find, the trails more subtle in their deception. They've learned that modern humans are harder to isolate completely, that missing persons investigations and search and rescue operations pose a threat to their ancient feeding grounds. Marcus and I broke up 6 months after we returned from Hawaii. The trauma had changed us both in ways that made maintaining a relationship impossible. He moved back east and started therapy while I stayed in Oregon and tried to pretend that nothing had happened. I still hike, though never alone and never in areas I can't research thoroughly beforehand. The wilderness calls to me the same way it always has, but now I listen more carefully to the voices warning me away from certain places. When locals tell stories about valleys where people disappear, I pay attention. When trail websites seem too good to be true, I look for the details that mark them as traps. And sometimes when I'm deep in the Oregon forests where I grew up, I catch glimpses of movement that doesn't belong to any natural creature. Shapes that flow between trees like liquid shadow. Eyes that reflect light from impossible angles. Sounds that might be human voices if they weren't twisted by something that has never been human. The network is larger than I thought. The feeders are everywhere, patient and hungry and waiting for the next group of adventurers who think they can conquer any wilderness. The Lama Valley taught me that there are places in this world where human beings are not the apex predator, where our technology and knowledge and civilization mean nothing against entities that were ancient when our species was learning to make fire. We exist in a bubble of safety that we've created through ignorance and denial. But the bubble has holes, and sometimes people fall through. I survived because Marcus remembered how their systems worked, because cold iron could still wound things that claimed to be beyond physical harm, because even the oldest predators can make mistakes when their feeding patterns are disrupted. But mostly, I survived because I got lucky. The others, the dozens of people we couldn't save, the hundreds who had been taken over the centuries before us, weren't so fortunate. They remain part of the valley's collection, their fear preserved like insects in amber, their suffering feeding something that shouldn't exist in a rational universe. And somewhere in the remote mountains of Hawaii, In valleys that appear and disappear from human awareness like mirages, the feeders continue their eternal harvest. They adapt to changing times, learn new ways to lure the curious and the adventurous away from safety. They're patient, persistent, and utterly without mercy. The wilderness is not empty. It never was. We just tell ourselves it is because the truth is too terrible to accept. There are things in the wild places that have been hunting us since before we climbed down from the trees, and they're very, very good at what they do. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 28 years old. I survived 4 days in hell and lived to tell about it. But survival isn't the same as escape, because now I know what's waiting in the spaces between the known and the unknown, and that knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my life. The valley remembers me. Sometimes, late at night, I receive emails with no sender address containing photographs of myself hiking in places I've never been. In the images, I'm always looking over my shoulder with an expression of growing terror, as if I can sense something following me just out of frame. They're still watching, still waiting, still hoping I'll be foolish enough to venture too far from the light, but I won't give them that satisfaction. I've seen what lies in the shadows between the trees, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure others know to be afraid of the dark places where ancient hungers never sleep. Because the next time someone goes missing in a remote valley where the trail markers disappear and the GPS stops working, where the fire won't light and time moves like thick honey, there might not be anyone left to tell their story. The wilderness is vast and full of wonders, but some wonders are designed to be the last thing you ever see. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote Waipio Valley on the big island of Hawaii, where the trade winds carry more than just the scent of plumeria, and the old legends still walk among the living. My boyfriend Marcus and I had planned this backpacking trip for months. We were both burned out from our corporate jobs in Honolulu. He was an accountant, I worked in marketing, and we desperately needed to disconnect. The Waipio Valley seemed perfect. Isolated, stunningly beautiful, and far from the tourist crowds that plagued most of Hawaii. Marcus had done extensive research, printing out topographic maps and marking campsites along the valley floor near the ancient taro fields. "It's called the Valley of the Kings," Marcus explained as we loaded our packs into his Jeep that Thursday morning. "Hawaiian royalty used to live there. It's supposed to be sacred." I should have paid more attention to that word. Sacred. In Hawaii, sacred places demand respect, and some demand much more. The drive to the Waipio Valley Lookout took us through increasingly remote terrain. Cell service died somewhere near Honoka, and by the time we reached the lookout point, we felt completely severed from civilization. The valley spread below us like a green cathedral, its black sand beach meeting walls of emerald cliff that rose nearly 2,000 feet into misty clouds. "Jesus," I whispered, shouldering my pack. "It's incredible." The hike down the switchback trail was brutal, a 25% grade that left our legs screaming and our lungs burning in the humid air. But when we reached the valley floor, stepping into that primordial landscape felt like entering another world. Massive kukui trees draped in moss towered above us, their branches creating a natural canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into ethereal beams. The sound of Waipo'o Falls echoed from somewhere deep in the valley, a constant whisper that seemed to speak in an ancient language. We made camp near the ruins of an old settlement, where crumbling stone foundations poked through the undergrowth like broken teeth. Marcus spread out his map while I gathered kindling, both of us giddy with the adventure of it all. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a section of the map. "There's supposed to be a series of caves about 2 miles inland near the base of the Hilau Falls, some kind of lava tubes. Could be cool to explore tomorrow." I nodded, but something about the ruins made me uneasy. They were too quiet, as if even the insects avoided them. When I mentioned this to Marcus, he laughed. "Babe, We're in paradise. What could possibly go wrong? That first night, I woke to the sound of chanting. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind moving through the valley, but there was a rhythm to it. Low, melodic voices rising and falling in what sounded like Hawaiian. I lay in our tent, listening, my heart beating faster as the sound seemed to circle our campsite. "Marcus," I whispered, shaking his shoulder, "do you hear that?" He mumbled something and rolled over. The chanting continued for maybe 10 more minutes before fading away, leaving only the natural sounds of the valley night. I convinced myself it had been the wind, or maybe wild pigs moving through the brush. But sleep didn't come easily after that. Morning brought relief. The valley was gorgeous in the early light, with clouds of mist rising from the stream that wound between ancient taro patches. We ate breakfast and packed day packs for our hike to the caves, both of us eager to explore deeper into this untouched wilderness. The trail inland was barely visible, more of a game path than anything meant for humans. We pushed through thick vegetation, following the sound of rushing water toward the base of the towering cliffs. The air grew cooler and more humid as we climbed, and strange flowers I'd never seen before bloomed in impossible colors among the ferns. "This place is like something out of Jurassic Park," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I keep expecting to see a dinosaur." We found the first cave around noon, a gaping mouth in the rock face that exhaled cool, mineral-scented air. Marcus shined his headlamp into the darkness, revealing a lava tube that extended far beyond the reach of our lights. "Should we go in?" I asked, though something deep in my gut was screaming, "No." "Just a little way," Marcus said. "I brought rope if we need it." The cave was larger than it appeared from outside, with smooth walls that curved overhead like the inside of a giant throat. Our footsteps echoed strangely, creating sounds that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The temperature dropped significantly as we moved deeper, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. About 50 yards in, we found the first carving. It was crude but unmistakably human-made. Spirals and angular shapes cut into the lava rock, along with what looked like representations of human figures. But these figures were wrong somehow. Too tall, with limbs that bent in unnatural directions. "Hawaiian petroglyphs," Marcus said, running his fingers over the carvings. "This stuff could be hundreds of years old." "We should go," I said. The carvings made my skin crawl, especially the figures that seemed to be reaching toward something just outside the carved frame. "This feels like someplace we shouldn't be." 5 more minutes, Marcus insisted, moving deeper into the cave with his light. "There might be more carvings." I followed reluctantly, my own headlamp beam dancing across the smooth walls. The tunnel curved sharply ahead, and as we rounded the bend, our lights illuminated something that made us both freeze. Bones. Human bones, arranged in careful patterns on natural shelves in the rock. Skulls grinned down at us from alcoves, and longer bones were laid out in geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. Some of the bones were clearly ancient, darkened with age, but others looked disturbingly fresh. "Holy shit," Marcus breathed. "This is a burial cave. We need to get out of here now." We backed away from the bone chamber, but as we turned to leave, my headlamp caught something that made my blood freeze. Fresh scratches in the cave wall, letters carved deep into the rock. "Help me." Below that, in smaller letters, "They took Sarah." And below that, a date from just 2 months ago. We ran. There's no other word for it. We ran through that cave as if the dead were chasing us, stumbling over rocks and scraping against walls until we burst into the blessed daylight of the valley. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite, where we collapsed, gasping and shaking. "Someone was trapped in there," I said between breaths. "Recently, we have to call for help." "With what?" Marcus held up his phone, showing the same no service message we'd been seeing since leaving Honoka. "And who are we going to tell? That we found some scratches in a cave?" those weren't just scratches. Marcus, someone carved a message asking for help. People explore caves all the time. Could have been from years ago, even if the date looked recent. Cave air preserves things. But even as he said it, I could see doubt in his eyes. We'd both seen how fresh those scratches looked, how the rock dust from the carving was still bright white against the dark stone. That afternoon, we tried to hike out to find cell service, but the trail that had brought us down into the valley seemed different somehow. Paths we remembered branched in directions that didn't match Marcus's map, and landmarks we'd noted on the way in were simply gone. After 3 hours of hiking in circles, we found ourselves back at our campsite, exhausted and confused. "The map must be wrong," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Or we're just turned around. We'll figure it out tomorrow." As darkness fell, I noticed that the normal sounds of the valley had changed. The birds that had been singing all day went silent as soon as the sun touched the cliff walls. Even the stream seemed quieter, as if the water itself was trying not to make noise. The silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like being inside a tomb. We'd just finished a dinner of canned chili when we heard the first scream. It came from somewhere up the valley, high-pitched and unmistakably human. The sound echoed off the cliff walls, distorting and multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus and I looked at each other, both of us frozen with our spoons halfway to our mouths. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. The scream came again, closer this time, and with it came the sound of something crashing through the undergrowth. Something big, moving fast, heading in our direction. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone out there? Do you need help?" I wanted to tell him to shut up, that calling attention to ourselves was the last thing we should do, but before I could speak, a voice answered from the darkness beyond our campfire. "Help me," it said. A woman's voice, weak and desperate. "Please, they took my friends. I've been running for days." The voice came from the direction of the old ruins, and as Marcus swept his flashlight beam across the stone foundations, we saw her. A young woman, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and torn hiking clothes. She was standing just at the edge of our light, and something about her posture seemed wrong. Too rigid, like a mannequin posed to look human. "Come closer," Marcus said, taking a step toward her. "You're safe now. What happened to your friends?" The woman moved into the light, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. She was beautiful in an almost ethereal way, with perfect features and skin that seemed to glow in the firelight. But her eyes were completely black, no whites or pupils visible, just endless darkness that seemed to swallow the light. "Marcus," I said quietly, grabbing his arm, "don't." But he was already walking toward her, his flashlight beam wavering. "What's your name?" he asked. "How long have you been out here?" "Sarah," she said, and my blood turned to ice, the name carved into the cave wall. "My name is Sarah, and I've been waiting so long for someone to find me." She smiled then, and her teeth were wrong. Too many of them, filed to sharp points that gleamed like knives in the firelight. Marcus stopped walking, finally sensing the wrongness that had been screaming at me since she appeared. "You're not human," I said, standing up slowly. "What are you?" Sarah's smile widened impossibly, stretching far beyond what human facial muscles should allow. "I'm whatever you need me to be," she said. "Whatever will make you come closer." Marcus backed toward me, his flashlight beam shaking violently. "What do you want?" "The same thing I wanted from the others," Sarah said, and now her voice was changing, becoming deeper, more resonant. "To add you to my collection." She began to change then, her human appearance falling away like a shed skin. Her limbs stretched and twisted, becoming too long and jointed in too many places. Her face elongated into something resembling a wolf's snout, but with those terrible human teeth. Her skin turned the color of old leather, and tufts of coarse black hair sprouted from her arms and back. "Lapu," I whispered, remembering stories my Hawaiian grandmother had told me as a child. "You're a Lapu." The thing that had been Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Smart girl. Your grandmother taught you the old stories, didn't she? But did she teach you how to survive one?" I grabbed Marcus's hand and ran, leaving our campsite and everything in it behind. We crashed through the underbrush in the darkness, guided only by my small keychain flashlight and the sound of the thing pursuing us. It moved through the trees like liquid shadow, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind, always just at the edge of our vision. We reached the stream and followed it toward the valley mouth, but the landscape had changed again. The familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by twisted trees and rock formations that hadn't been there before. The stream itself seemed to be flowing uphill in places, defying gravity and logic. "The valley," I gasped as we ran. "It's not letting us leave." Behind us, the Lapu's laughter echoed off invisible walls. "No one leaves," it called. "Not until I'm finished with them." We found shelter in a shallow cave, not one of the deep lava tubes, just a depression in the rock face that we could defend. Marcus had grabbed a large knife from our camp before we ran, and I had a can of bear spray that probably wouldn't work on a supernatural creature, but made me feel slightly better anyway. For hours, we huddled in that cave while the Lapu stalked outside. Sometimes it would mimic Marcus's voice, calling my name and begging me to come out. Other times it sounded like my sister, or my mother, or friends from back home. But I could always hear the wrongness underneath, the inhuman quality that no amount of mimicry could completely hide. As dawn approached, the sounds outside faded. Supernatural creatures were supposed to lose power in daylight, another thing my grandmother had taught me. When the sun finally rose over the cliff walls, we cautiously emerged from our hiding place. The valley looked different in the morning light. Normal, almost. Birds were singing again, and the stream flowed in the proper direction. Our campsite was visible about half a mile away, looking exactly as we'd left it. "Maybe it's over," Marcus said hopefully. "Maybe the thing is gone." But I could feel eyes watching us from the shadows under the trees, and I knew the Lapu was just waiting for nightfall. We spent the day trying again to find a way out of the valley, but every trail led us in circles. The switchback path we'd descended 2 days ago simply wasn't there anymore. The cliff face was unbroken rock where the trail should have been. By afternoon, we were forced to accept the terrible truth. We were trapped. "There has to be a way," Marcus said as we sat by the stream. "People don't just disappear. There are search and rescue teams." "Who's going to search for us?" I asked. "We didn't tell anyone exactly where we were going. And look around. Does this place even exist on maps anymore?" As if to confirm my fears, Marcus pulled out his GPS unit. The screen showed our location as being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The second night was worse. The Lapu didn't try to trick us with mimicry this time. Instead, it showed us what it had done to previous victims. The thing appeared at the edge of our firelight carrying something in its elongated arms. As it moved closer, I realized it was a human torso, so mutilated I couldn't tell if it had been male or female. The skin had been flayed in careful strips, and the remaining muscle tissue bore teeth marks from feeding. "This was David," the Lapu said conversationally, holding up the remains. "He begged so prettily before I started on him. His girlfriend, Jessica, lasted 3 days before her heart gave out from the fear." It threw the torso at our feet, and the smell that rose from it, decay and blood, and something else, something sweet and wrong, made me vomit violently. "I like to take my time," the Lapu continued, circling our campfire. "Humans taste better when they've been properly tenderized by terror. The fear changes the chemistry of the meat, makes it more flavorful." Marcus stood up with his knife, but I could see his hands shaking. "Stay back," he said. "I'll fight you." The Lapu laughed. "Oh, you'll fight. They all fight eventually. But first, you'll scream." It vanished into the darkness, leaving us alone with the mutilated remains and the certainty that tomorrow night would be our last. That's when I remembered the rest of my grandmother's stories. Lapu were powerful, nearly invincible, but they had weaknesses. They were bound to the places where they hunted, unable to cross running water or enter blessed ground, and they could be injured, not killed, but hurt badly enough to give victims a chance to escape. "The burial cave," I said suddenly. "It's sacred ground. If we can get there, we might be safe." "Are you crazy?" Marcus stared at me. That place was terrifying. Terrifying to us, but think about it. The Lapu brought us to see that cave for a reason. It wanted us to be afraid of the bones, the carvings. But Hawaiian burial sites are kapu, forbidden, sacred. No evil spirit can enter them. It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. We waited until the darkest part of the night, then slipped away from our camp and made our way back to the lava tube. The Lapu was hunting somewhere else in the valley. We could hear its inhuman calls echoing from the far end, but I knew it would sense our movement soon enough. The cave mouth yawned before us like the entrance to hell itself, but I forced myself to enter. The bone chamber was exactly as we'd left it, skulls grinning down from their alcoves in the eternal darkness. But as soon as we crossed the threshold into that sacred space, I felt the oppressive presence that had been pressing down on us lift slightly. We'd been hiding in the bone chamber for maybe an hour when the Lapu found us. It appeared at the cave entrance, its inhuman form silhouetted against the lesser darkness outside. But it didn't enter. Couldn't enter, I realized with relief. Instead, it paced back and forth across the threshold, its rage palpable. "Clever girl," it snarled. "But you can't stay in there forever. Eventually, you'll have to come out." "Maybe," I called back, "but morning's coming soon, and you can't hunt in the daylight." The Lapu's laugh was like fingernails on stone. "Who told you that old wives' tale? I hunt whenever I please. Day or night makes no difference to me." My heart sank. If that was true, we were finished. We had no food or water in the cave, and we couldn't stay indefinitely among the bones of the ancient dead. But then I noticed something. The Lapu's voice was weaker now, less resonant, and its form seemed less solid, more translucent in the growing light. Maybe daylight didn't destroy it, but it certainly seemed to diminish its power. "There's something else," I said to Marcus quietly. "The carvings on the wall. They're not just decorations. They're wards, protections. This whole cave is designed to keep evil spirits out." I began to examine the petroglyphs more carefully, using Marcus's flashlight to illuminate the ancient symbols. Most were spirals and geometric patterns, but some clearly depicted human figures in what looked like ritual poses. And there, near the chamber's center, was a carving that made my pulse quicken. A human figure holding something that looked like fire, facing off against a creature with too many limbs and a wolf-like head. "This is it," I whispered. "This is how they fought it." The carving showed the human figure not running from the creature but confronting it directly. The fire in the figure's hands wasn't just any fire. There were specific markings around it, symbols that looked like they represented purification. "Sacred fire," I said, remembering more of my grandmother's stories. Some spirits can only be hurt by flames blessed by the ancestors. But we had no sacred fire, just a plastic lighter and some matches. Still, surrounded by the bones of Hawaiian royalty in this ancient burial chamber, maybe our ordinary flames could be blessed by proximity. As the sun rose higher, the Lapu's presence outside the cave grew weaker, but I knew it wouldn't leave. It would wait, patient as stone, for us to emerge, unless we found a way to drive it off permanently. I gathered some dried bones from the chamber floor, not the human remains, which would have been deeply disrespectful, but small animal bones that had been placed as offerings. Using my lighter, I set them ablaze, and the flame that resulted was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It burned with a pure white light that seemed to illuminate not just the cave, but something deeper, the spiritual essence of the place itself. "Now," I said to Marcus, "we run for the valley entrance, and if that thing comes after us, we fight it with this." We emerged from the cave into the morning light, and immediately the Lapu was there, materializing from the shadows under the trees. But something was different about it now. In full daylight, I could see that it was wounded. Old scars crisscrossed its hide, and one of its arms hung at an unnatural angle. Other people had fought this thing before, and some had managed to hurt it. "You think fire will save you?" it snarled, but I heard uncertainty in its voice. I held the burning bones higher, and the Lapu actually took a step back. The sacred flame was working. We began moving toward the valley mouth, the Lapu pacing us but maintaining its distance from the fire. Several times it tried to circle around behind us, but each time I turned the flames in its direction, and each time it retreated. The trail that had been invisible for 2 days suddenly reappeared as we approached the cliff face, steep switchbacks leading up and out of the valley prison. The Lapu's howls of rage echoed behind us as we climbed, but it couldn't follow. Whatever power it had over the valley's geography was broken by our resistance, by the sacred fire, by our refusal to be its victims. We climbed for what felt like hours, our legs screaming from the effort, but neither of us dared to look back until we reached the top of the cliff. Only then did I allow myself to turn around and look down into the Waipio Valley. From above, it looked normal again. Beautiful, peaceful, no sign of the nightmare we'd endured. But I could still see the Lapu down there, a tiny dark figure standing among the trees, watching us, waiting for the next victims to stumble into its domain. Marcus's jeep was exactly where we'd left it, and his cell phone immediately found signal as soon as we cleared the valley rim. We drove straight to the Hilo police station, where we tried to report what we'd experienced. The officer who took our statement was polite but clearly skeptical, especially when we described finding human remains in the cave. "We'll send someone to check it out," he said, but his tone suggested he wouldn't be in any hurry. I wonder if they ever did. I wonder if they found the bone chamber, or if the valley rearranged itself again to hide the evidence of the Lapu's hunting ground. I wonder how many other people have vanished into that beautiful cursed place over the centuries. What I know for certain is that we were lucky. We survived because I remembered my grandmother's stories, because we found sanctuary in sacred ground, and because we fought back when fighting seemed impossible. But mostly, we survived because something ancient and protective in that burial cave decided to help us. The Lapu is still down there in the Waipio Valley, still hunting, still waiting. The legends say it can't be killed, only wounded or driven away temporarily. So, if you ever find yourself planning a camping trip to the remote valleys of Hawaii, remember this: some places are beautiful precisely because they're dangerous. Some silences are not peaceful but predatory, and some legends persist because they're not legends at all, but warnings passed down through generations of survivors. The valley may call to you with its pristine wilderness and ancient mysteries, but if you hear chanting in the night, or find fresh carvings in old caves, or meet someone who claims to need help but has eyes like endless darkness, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and don't look back until you're sure you've reached the light, because in the Valley of the Kings, not all the royalty is dead, and not all the hunters are human. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote valleys of the Nepali coast in Kauai, Hawaii, where the ancient Hawaiian spirits are said to still walk among the living. I should have listened to the locals in Hanalei when they warned us about hiking the Kalalau Trail during the new moon. They spoke in hushed tones about the night marchers, ancient Hawaiian warriors who patrol the coastline, and worse things that lurk in the valleys where few dare to venture. But Sarah Rodriguez, my best friend since college, had been planning this trip for months after her messy divorce, and I couldn't let her down. "It'll be therapeutic," she had said, her dark eyes still carrying the weight of betrayal. Just us, the ocean, and 11 miles of the most beautiful coastline in the world. We started our hike at Kea Beach just after dawn, our backpacks loaded with 3 days' worth of supplies. The trail began innocuously enough, winding through lush tropical vegetation with glimpses of the sapphire Pacific through the trees. Sarah seemed lighter already, her usual nervous energy replaced by something approaching peace. The first 2 miles to Hanakapiai Beach were crowded with day hikers, but as we continued past the treacherous waterfall trail, the crowds thinned until we were alone with the sound of waves crashing against the fluted cliffs below. The trail grew narrower and more treacherous, carved into cliff faces that dropped hundreds of feet to jagged rocks and churning water. "God, it's beautiful," Sarah breathed as we stopped at an overlook. The Nepali coast stretched before us in impossible shades of green and blue, its cathedral spires and knife-edge ridges looking like something from another world. But even then, I felt it, a wrongness that I couldn't quite place. The air felt too thick, too still despite the ocean breeze. And there was a smell, faint but persistent, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. We made camp that first night at Hanakoa Valley, setting up our tent in a grove of kukui trees near the stream. As darkness fell, the usual symphony of insects and tree frogs was strangely muted. Sarah noticed it too. "It's so quiet," she said, stirring our camp stove pasta with a plastic spoon. "Almost too quiet." I tried to laugh it off. "We're just used to city noise. This is what nature actually sounds like." But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong. I'd been camping since I was a kid, and I'd never experienced silence like this. Oppressive and expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. Our first sign of real trouble came when Sarah went to filter water from the stream before bed. She'd been gone maybe 10 minutes when I heard her calling my name, her voice tight with panic. "Jen, you need to see this." I found her crouched by the water's edge, her headlamp beam focused on something in the mud. Footprints, but not human ones. These were larger, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I knelt beside her, studying the prints. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp earth. But what made my skin crawl was their placement. They led directly to our campsite, circled it once, then disappeared into the dense forest. "Probably just a wild pig," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. "They're all over the island." But pigs don't walk on 2 legs, and these prints showed a clear bipedal gait. We retreated to our tent earlier than planned, zipping it tight and checking the mesh for holes. Sarah clutched her phone, its screen showing no signal bars. "When did we lose service?" she asked. I checked mine, also dead. Not just no signal, but completely powered down despite showing a full charge when we'd started hiking. "The battery must have drained faster than expected," I said, but my hands were shaking as I tried to power it back on. Nothing. We lay in our sleeping bags, listening to the unnatural silence outside. Just as I was beginning to drift off, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, came the sound of something large moving through the underbrush nearby. Branches snapped, leaves rustled, and underneath it all, a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural breathing that definitely wasn't human. The sounds circled our tent for what felt like hours, sometimes coming close enough that I could hear individual footsteps in the leaf litter. Sarah and I lay frozen, afraid even to whisper. Whatever was out there seemed to be studying us, taking its time. Just before dawn, the sound stopped. We broke camp in silence, neither of us wanting to acknowledge what we'd experienced. In the pale morning light, everything seemed normal again. Birds were singing, insects buzzing, the stream babbling cheerfully over smooth stones. But when we went to retrieve our water bottles from outside the tent, they were gone. "I know I left them right here," Sarah said, pointing to an empty spot beside a fallen log. "We searched the area thoroughly but found nothing. It was as if they'd simply vanished." The second day's hike was brutal. The trail grew increasingly treacherous as we climbed over the saddle between valleys, the path sometimes narrowing to mere inches with heart-stopping drops on both sides. But it wasn't the physical challenge that had us on edge. It was the growing sense that we were being watched. "There's someone following us," Sarah said during a rest stop, her voice barely audible over the wind. I turned to look back down the trail but saw nothing. "What do you mean?" "I keep seeing movement in my peripheral vision, and sometimes I hear footsteps when we stop walking." I'd noticed it too, but hadn't wanted to admit it. A shadow that seemed to duck behind trees whenever I turned to look. The sound of displaced rocks falling somewhere behind us on the trail. "It's probably just another hiker," I said, but even I didn't believe it. We pressed on, eager to reach our second campsite at Kalalau Valley before dark. But as the afternoon wore on, our pace slowed. Sarah began complaining of dizziness and nausea. "I think I'm getting altitude sickness," she said, though we were barely 1,000 feet above sea level. Her face was pale and drawn, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool ocean breeze. When she stumbled for the third time in 10 minutes, I insisted we take a longer break. "Maybe we should turn back," I suggested, but Sarah shook her head firmly. "We're more than halfway there. It would take us just as long to go back as to push forward." She was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that continuing was a mistake. The wrongness I'd felt since the beginning was growing stronger, like a pressure building behind my eyes. We reached Kalalau Beach just as the sun was setting, painting the massive cliffs in shades of gold and crimson. The valley was stunning, a hidden paradise tucked between towering peaks with a waterfall cascading from the mountains and a pristine beach that looked untouched by human hands. But paradise had a price. As we set up camp in a grove of ironwood trees, I noticed things that made no sense. Our water bottles, the ones that had vanished that morning, were sitting neatly beside a fire ring that hadn't been there when we'd first surveyed the campsite. "Did you put these here?" I asked Sarah, holding up one of the bottles. She looked confused. "How could I? We just got here." The bottles were full of crystal clear water that tasted better than anything I'd ever drunk. But where had it come from, and who had filled them? As night fell, the wrongness intensified. Our campfire, which had been burning steadily, suddenly guttered and died despite having plenty of fuel. When I tried to relight it, the flames kept going out as if something was blowing them out. But there was no wind. "This is getting ridiculous," Sarah muttered, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd been growing quieter and more withdrawn as the day progressed, her eyes taking on a distant quality that worried me. We ate cold food by flashlight and retreated to our tent early. But sleep wouldn't come. The silence was back, even more oppressive than the night before. And then, around midnight, Sarah started talking in her sleep. At first, it was just mumbling, disconnected words and phrases that might have been dreams about her ex-husband or work stress. But gradually, her voice grew clearer, and what she was saying made my skin crawl. "They're waiting," she whispered, her eyes still closed. "In the water. They've been waiting so long." "Sarah," I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Wake up. You're having a nightmare." Her eyes snapped open, but they weren't quite right. In the dim light filtering through the tent walls, her pupils looked too large, too dark. "Do you hear them singing?" she asked in a voice that didn't sound entirely like hers. I strained to listen and felt my heart stop. There was singing, faint but unmistakable. Women's voices harmonizing in a language I didn't recognize, coming from the direction of the beach. "Who would be singing at this hour?" I asked, but Sarah had already unzipped the tent and was crawling outside. "Sarah, wait!" I grabbed my flashlight and followed her, but she was already walking toward the beach with an odd, mechanical gait. The singing grew louder as we approached the water. In the moonlight, I could see figures in the surf, women with long dark hair that flowed around them like seaweed. They were beautiful and terrible, their skin pale as moonlight, their eyes reflecting the starlight like mirrors. Sarah walked straight toward them, and I realized with horror that she was going into the water fully clothed, her boots and hiking clothes becoming waterlogged as she waded deeper. "Sarah, stop!" I splashed after her, the cold Pacific shocking me fully awake. "What are you doing?" But when she turned to look at me, Her face was blank, emotionless. The Sarah I knew was gone, replaced by something wearing her features like a mask. "They want me to come with them," she said in that strange, distant voice. "They've been so lonely." The singing stopped abruptly, and the figures in the water turned their attention to me. Their faces were lovely, but wrong somehow. Too perfect, too symmetrical, like something had tried to recreate human beauty without quite understanding what made it appealing. One of them spoke, her voice carrying impossibly clearly across the water despite being barely above a whisper. "You cannot have her back," she said. "She chose to come to us." "I didn't choose anything," Sarah suddenly screamed, her own voice breaking through whatever influence had held her. "Help me, Jen. I can't move my legs." I grabbed her arm and pulled, trying to drag her back to shore, but it was like trying to move a statue. She was rigid, immovable, her feet seemingly rooted to the ocean floor. The water around us began to churn, and I felt something brush against my legs. Something smooth and cold that definitely wasn't seaweed. "Run!" Sarah gasped, her moment of clarity fading. "Before they take you too." I pulled harder, but she was slipping deeper into whatever trance held her. The water was up to her chest now, and the figures were gliding closer, their movements too fluid to be entirely human. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't women at all. Not anymore. Their lower bodies were wrong, scaled and serpentine with fins where legs should be. And their mouths, when they smiled, revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. Hawaiian legends spoke of them. The mo'o, dragon spirits that could take human form. They were said to be guardians of fresh water, but these seemed different, corrupted somehow. Their eyes held an ancient hunger that had nothing to do with protection. I made a choice that still haunts me. I let go of Sarah's arm and ran. Behind me, I heard her scream my name once before the sound was cut off by a splash. When I reached the beach and turned back, the water was calm, empty. Sarah and the creatures were gone. I spent the rest of the night huddled in our tent, too terrified to sleep. When dawn broke, I packed everything I could carry and started back down the trail, moving as fast as the treacherous path would allow. But the nightmare wasn't over. I'd been hiking for maybe an hour when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps that matched my pace exactly. Every time I stopped, they stopped. Every time I sped up, they sped up. "Sarah," I called hopefully, but there was no answer. When I finally worked up the courage to turn around, I saw her, or something wearing her face. She was standing about 50 yards back on the trail, perfectly still, wearing the same clothes she'd had on the night before. But they were dry, which was impossible, and her hair, which should have been tangled with seaweed and salt, hung in perfect waves around her shoulders. "Why did you leave me?" she asked, her voice carrying impossibly well across the distance. I wanted to run to her, to apologize and help her, but something about the way she stood, too straight, too still, kept me frozen in place. "I tried to help you," I called back. "You disappeared into the water." She tilted her head in a gesture that was almost but not quite like Sarah's characteristic head tilt. "I'm here now. We can go home together." But as she spoke, I noticed that her mouth wasn't quite syncing with her words, like a badly dubbed movie, and her eyes, Sarah's warm brown eyes, were now the color of deep ocean water. "You're not Sarah," I whispered. The thing wearing my friend's face smiled, and I saw those needle teeth behind her familiar lips. "I am now," it said. I ran. The thing that looked like Sarah followed me for miles, always staying just out of sight but never falling behind. I could hear it calling my name in Sarah's voice, begging me to wait, to help her, to come back. Sometimes the pleas sounded so genuine that I almost stopped. But then I'd catch a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision, standing too straight, moving too smoothly, its feet never quite touching the ground. The trail seemed longer on the way back, stretching endlessly through valleys that I didn't remember from our hike-in. At one point, I was sure I'd somehow gotten turned around, because I found myself at overlooks I'd never seen before, looking down at beaches that shouldn't exist. My water ran out. My food ran out. But I kept walking, driven by terror and the growing certainty that if I stopped, if I let the thing catch up to me, I would disappear just like Sarah had. It was nearly dark on the second day when I finally saw the parking area at K Beach. I'd never been so happy to see pavement and tourists in my life, but as I stumbled toward my rental car, I heard Sarah's voice one last time. "Jen, wait, don't leave me here." I turned, and there she was at the trailhead, looking exactly like the Sarah I remembered. Dirty hiking clothes, tangled hair, a concerned expression that was perfectly, heartbreakingly familiar. For a moment, I wavered. What if I'd imagined everything? What if she'd somehow survived and made it back on her own? But then I noticed her feet. They weren't quite touching the ground. I got in my car and drove away without looking back. The police didn't believe me, of course. Search and rescue teams combed the Kalalau Valley for days but found no trace of Sarah Rodriguez. The official report listed her as a hiking accident victim, presumed drowned. Her body was never recovered. I tried to move on to convince myself that it had all been some kind of stress-induced breakdown, but 6 months later, I got a text from Sarah's number. "Miss you. Come visit soon." I changed my phone number and moved to a different state, but sometimes late at night I still hear her voice calling my name, and sometimes when I'm near large bodies of water, I see a familiar figure standing just at the edge of my vision, always perfectly still, always watching. I know she's waiting for me to come back. The thing that wears her face, that stole her voice and memories and smile, it's patient, the way predators are patient. It knows that eventually, guilt and grief will drive me back to that hidden valley, back to the water where my best friend disappeared. But I won't go. I can't, because I know that if I do, there will be 2 figures standing at the edge of the surf when the next group of hikers arrives. 2 women with beautiful faces and terrible smiles, singing their ancient song of loneliness and hunger, and we'll be waiting for someone new to join us in the deep, dark water where the mo'o make their home. The thing that took Sarah's place is still out there, somewhere on the Nepali coast, still calling my name, still wearing my best friend's face, still waiting. I've never been back to Hawaii. I never will. Some places are too beautiful to be safe, and some losses are too terrible to survive twice. But if you're planning to hike the Kalalau Trail, especially during the new moon, listen to the locals when they warn you about the night marchers and other things that walk the valleys. They know what they're talking about. And if you hear singing coming from the water at night, don't listen too closely. Don't get too close, and whatever you do, don't go in the water, no matter who's calling your name.